Duke Baltasar is addressed, appearing deep in thought. Klaus of Baltasar, Duke of the Lugvelzit Empire, confirms he was informed his presence was requested. A green-haired individual affirms to Klaus that there is indeed a matter requiring his attention. Klaus declares his intention to investigate, pinning the green-haired individual, who nervously questions what will be checked. Klaus leans in, his tone menacing, as he reminds the individual about a prior warning concerning a particular perfume. The green-haired person denies wearing any perfume and is sternly told to speak clearly, identified as the servant who appeared instead of the light. He, the light, knows the servant's name is Antonio de Hessink, confidently stating his proficiency at uncovering secrets. Antonio is left speechless, as Klaus declares his resolve to uncover whatever Antonio is concealing. A wave of panic washes over Antonio as he internally questions if the Duke has discovered his secret. Antonio's fear intensifies, specifically worrying that Klaus has found out he is a woman. Klaus issues a stern command to Antonio, warning him not to attempt hiding anything from his scrutiny. The Duke muses with growing interest that the more he considers it, the stronger his desire to uncover Antonio's secrets becomes. Antonio nervously contemplates how the Duke might react if he genuinely didn't mind that Antonio is perceived as male. Antonio internally despairs, reflecting that the entire purpose of his disguise as a man was to prevent this very kind of confrontation. A sense of hopelessness washes over Antonio as he questions the possibility of significantly altering the predetermined course of the original novel. The scene shifts to 3 months earlier, punctuated by the distinct sound of shattering glass. Months earlier, Antonio, punctuated by the appearing distinct sound of disheveled, urgently demands Roselia fetch him a drink, announcing that all the alcohol has been consumed. Roselia de Hessink, identified as the adopted daughter of Baron Hessink, lets out a sigh of weary resignation. Antonio aggressively interrogates Roselia about their lack of funds, expressing disbelief that his father would have left her with nothing. Roselia calmly informs Antonio that the reason he is unaware of their financial state is because he himself squandered all their money. A frustrated Antonio, finding no money, coarsely orders Roselia to bring him something of monetary value instead. Roselia recalls the recent past. Her father, Baron Hessink, fell gravely ill, leading to the swift collapse of their family fortune. Holding a knife, Roselia observes her brother, the supposed successor, with disdain for his current pathetic condition. Antonio reacts with shock and fear to the sight of Roselia holding a knife, questioning her intentions as she silently judges him as subhuman. Roselia, her resolve hardening, declares it is time to dispose of this, while Antonio fearfully implores her to keep her distance. Roselia, now with strikingly short hair and holding her severed locks, coolly asks Antonio if he hadn't just requested something valuable, asserting that the moment has arrived. Roselia extends her cut hair towards a stunned Antonio, stating it is the last valuable thing she possesses, and instructing him to take it and depart. Antonio, with a look of revulsion over his shoulder, spits out a venomous insult, calling Roselia a toxic woman. Roselia, unperturbed by the insult, retorts that with her life on the line, she is capable of actions far more severe than merely being toxic. Roselia, now in the guise of Antonio, acknowledges a slight sense of discomfort in her current circumstances. Antonio is grimly informed that he will not be returning, a chill settling over him as 2 men lead him away. The men escorting Antonio inform him that his creditors await to settle his outstanding gambling debts. Roselia, now fully embodying Antonio, reflects on the uncertain fate of the original Antonio, unsure if he is alive or dead. She muses that the novel provided no details on his ultimate end, while noting that the clothes she wears as Antonio are a bit too large. Roselia, as Antonio, gazes out of a broken window, anticipating the arrival of he, the man who financially supports the body she now inhabits. A narrative flashback reveals Roselia de Hessink's original tragic destiny to become the Duke's exploited Maid of Darkness, ultimately leading to her death. Roselia, as Antonio, reflects on her original character's minor role as an extra, acknowledging that this is the body she now occupies. She recalls a key plot point from the novel, the Duke's intention to hire her as a maid. 3 years have elapsed since Roselia found herself in this novel, and she feels she has diligently prepared for this pivotal moment. With quiet determination, Roselia resolves that she will not succumb to the fate prescribed for her in the novel. Roselia remembers a crucial detail from the original story, Roselia's foolish act of falling in love with the Duke. Standing resolute, Roselia, as Antonio, asserts there are multiple ways to settle the debt, and her primary strategy is to avoid pleasing the Duke. Upon reaching an imposing house, Roselia, disguised as Antonio, wonders aloud if this is the correct location. After a brief check, Roselia, as Antonio, confirms that the address matches the one she was given. The Duke surveys the dilapidated state of the property with a critical eye. The Duke coldly remarks that even if the mansion were sold, the proceeds wouldn't cover even half of Baron Hessink's debt to him. An aide reports to the Duke that official documents confirm Baron Hessink's death and the inheritance of the estate by his eldest son, Antonio. The aide casually mentions that the late Baron Hessink also had a daughter named Roselia de Hessink. The aide informs the Duke that the Baron reportedly died from an illness just a few days prior, a fact the Duke seems to find shameful as a hand reaches out. Roselia, in her guise as Antonio, formally inquires if the imposing man before her is Duke Klaus of Balthasar, who appears taken aback. With a polite gesture, Roselia, as Antonio, extends her hand and expresses pleasure at meeting him. Roselia confidently introduces herself as Antonio de Hessink, the eldest son of the late Baron Hessink, offering a poised smile. A firm resolution echoes in Roselia's mind. She will never allow herself to fall in love with the Duke. Antonio de Hessink formally presents himself, declaring he is at the Duke's service. The Duke turns, pointedly asking Antonio if he is aware of his identity, prompting a feigned look of surprise from Antonio. Antonio, with a hint of nervousness, affirms that surely everyone within the Lugbelzit Empire would recognize Duke Balthazar. The Duke, exuding an aura of immense power, states that if Antonio knows who he is, then he must also understand the purpose of his visit: to collect the substantial debt owed by Antonio's late father. The Duke specifies the outstanding sum as 5,000 barangs, a figure that causes Antonio to visibly gulp in apprehension. Antonio internally reels at the sum, calculating it could purchase 3 large mansions and doubting his father owed so much, while the Duke notes the current mansion covers only 3,000. The Duke, arms crossed and expression stern, demands to know Antonio's plan for settling the remainder of the debt. Antonio forces a slight smile, acknowledging the Duke's implication that he currently lacks the resources for repayment. Antonio, with a downcast expression, concedes his present inability to pay, but indicates he has an alternative proposal. With a surge of confidence, Antonio boldly requests a 1-year grace period, promising to fully repay the remaining debt within that time frame. The Duke, his expression laced with skepticism, questions the feasibility of Antonio's ambitious plan. The Duke brings up damaging rumors: Antonio's alleged dropout from the academy and subsequent descent into alcoholism, causing Antonio to visibly wince. Antonio sheepishly concedes that the Duke's information regarding his past and apparent lack of notable skills is not entirely inaccurate. Antonio declares he possesses a potent, albeit unconventional, weapon, asserting that his time spent navigating the city's underbelly was not without purpose. The Duke, his curiosity piqued, inquires if Antonio has some secret strategy or advantage. Antonio confirms with confidence that he indeed has a plan, cryptically stating that his weapon is. Antonio's true ace in the hole is revealed in his thoughts, his comprehensive knowledge of the novel's plot. He mentally reviews crucial information from the novel: the future discovery of a mana crystal mine and a ship laden with sunken treasure. Antonio strategically decides that the most accessible path to wealth lies in the world of art. He recalls that the novel's heroine, the Crown Princess, possesses a keen interest in art and amassed a fortune by championing undiscovered artists. Antonio forms a resolute plan. He must reach these unknown artists before the Crown Princess does. Antonio excitedly outlines his strategy to leverage his street-gathered intelligence and discerning eye to acquire valuable artworks. The Duke concedes the plan has some merit, but raises a critical flaw: Antonio's lack of capital to purchase any art. Antonio cheerfully acknowledges the Duke's excellent point about needing startup capital, a fact the Duke finds painfully obvious. Antonio then declares that this financial predicament is precisely why he is making a request of the Duke, who looks utterly baffled. With a disarmingly sheepish grin, Antonio humbly asks if the Duke might consider lending him a mere 20 barangs. The Duke, thoroughly unimpressed, clarifies with thinly veiled sarcasm, if Antonio is seriously proposing to increase his already substantial debt. Antonio beams with unabashed enthusiasm, confirming the Duke's sarcastic interpretation. Antonio earnestly implores the Duke to place his trust in him just for this one occasion. He confidently vows to demonstrate the magic of transforming a meager 20 barangs into 500 within a short 2-month period. The Duke, despite expressing his considerable doubts, reluctantly agrees to lend Antonio the money, bringing a wave of relief to Antonio. Antonio bows deeply and repeatedly, expressing his profuse gratitude to the Duke. As Antonio is still bowing, the Duke interjects, stating that his agreement comes with a specific condition. Antonio is startled by the sudden appearance of 2 burly men behind him, wondering how and when they arrived. Panic seizes Antonio as the men apprehend him. He desperately questions their actions, insisting he intends to repay the debt. Antonio cries out to the Duke for help, but the Duke merely utters his name, Antonio, in a calm, unwavering tone. The Duke, a smirk playing on his lips, questions Antonio's trustworthiness, wondering what prevents him from absconding after making hollow promises. Caught off guard, Antonio stammers, admitting the Duke's point is valid but still clearly distressed by his predicament. Antonio desperately questions the Duke's skepticism, reiterating his commitment to repayment even as he's being forcibly escorted. The Duke, however, poses yet another logistical challenge. The Duke inquires about Antonio's living arrangements after the mansion's sale, a crucial detail Antonio admits he hadn't considered. The Duke states he will, for now, accept Antonio's word regarding the debt, but with a significant caveat. The Duke decrees that Antonio will repay the debt under his direct supervision, effectively placing Antonio under his control until the entire sum is settled. A chilling smile graces the Duke's lips as he informs Antonio that he will, for all intents and purposes, be treated as a servant within the ducal household. Antonio vehemently protests the unfairness of the situation, but the Duke curtly dismisses his plea and orders his men to remove Antonio. Antonio inwardly bemoans his fate, having meticulously planned to avoid becoming a maid, only to find himself ensnared as a disguised male servant within the Duke's household, carried away in defeat. Antonio arrives, not as a guest, but as an indentured servant, at the grand and imposing Balthazar ducal mansion. Alejandro, a ducal attendant, shows Antonio to a surprisingly opulent room, explaining it will be his quarters. Antonio is taken aback, noting it hardly resembles a typical servant's room. Alejandro clarifies that Antonio's circumstances are unique, setting him apart from the other servants. He further explains that Antonio holds a dual role, a servant to the household, yet also considered the Duke's business partner. Antonio is visibly perplexed by Alejandro's explanation of his unusual status. Alejandro proudly reveals Antonio has been assigned a special room, conveniently located near the Duke's office, a revelation that shocks Antonio. Alejandro enthusiastically highlights the room's prime location, a mere 5-second walk from the Duke's office, a proximity Antonio privately finds more dreadful than fantastic. Antonio reluctantly agrees to Alejandro's offer of a mansion tour, finding a sliver of solace in the fact that he won't be sharing quarters with the other male servants. As Alejandro guides him through the lavish halls, Antonio is suddenly struck by an inexplicable sense of discomfort. Antonio clutches his chest, wondering about the sudden, constricting tightness he feels. Gasping for air, Antonio finds it increasingly difficult to breathe and stumbles precariously. Antonio collides with something unexpectedly soft and yielding. He momentarily likens the sensation to falling into a cloud, before a young woman's voice sharply inquires how long he intends to continue holding her. Antonio hastily apologizes and releases the young woman, who then asks if he is a new servant. Alejandro rushes to the scene, exclaiming with alarm, "Oh dear lady," while Antonio, still disoriented, mentally registers her title. Antonio inwardly speculates whether this young lady might be Klaus's sister, as she scrutinizes him with open curiosity. The lady appraises Antonio and declares him quite handsome, candidly admitting her fondness for beautiful things. Antonio is visibly flustered by the unexpected compliment, while the lady exclaims, "Great," with satisfaction. Lady Closet de Balthazar, with a theatrical flourish, proclaims that from this day forward, Antonio shall be her personal il domestico. Both Antonio and Alejandro are stunned into silence by the lady's declaration, with Antonio mentally questioning the unfamiliar term il domestico. The narrative clarifies that il domestico is a current fashion among noblewomen, who retain handsome male servants primarily as decorative attendants. Antonio, recalling having heard of this trend, attempts to politely refuse Lady Closet's offer, feeling increasingly flustered by the unwanted attention. An older maidservant urgently calls out to Lady Closet, her summons startling both the young lady and Antonio. Lady Closet, completely disregarding Antonio's unspoken protest, decisively announces her intention to bring him to a gathering the following day and instructs him to prepare. The head maid urgently tries to intervene and halt Lady Closet, who is already caught up in her plans. Alejandro remarks that Antonio is rather fortunate to have captured the lady's attention on his very first day, a sentiment that makes Antonio doubt if this is truly a positive development. Antonio internally groans at the prospect of becoming an il domestico, a role he finds utterly undesirable. Lying on his bed later, Antonio broods over the situation, feeling he lacks the time for such frivolities and judging Lady Closet as rather self-centered. He recalls his critical promise to the Duke to repay 500 barangs within 2 months, the potential consequences of failure weighing heavily on his mind. Antonio impatiently wonders why Alejandro has not yet delivered the 20 barangs that were promised to him. Restlessly tossing on his bed, Antonio wishes Alejandro would arrive soon with the money, desperate for some measure of peace of mind. On his first unsettling night in the Duke's mansion, Antonio sits by the grand window, a sense of unease washing over him. He acknowledges the profound discomfort of his current, restrictive situation. He briefly considers removing the constricting chest bandage to alleviate his discomfort, even if only for a moment. Antonio resigns himself to the thought that Alejandro is merely late and might arrive tomorrow, regretting having mentioned the money at all. With a sigh of profound relief, Antonio finally removes the tight bandage, exclaiming that he can at last breathe freely. He reflects on how suffocating his disguised life is, admitting this constrained existence is not one he can easily endure. Antonio settles into bed, convinced that no one will disturb him until the morning light. He confidently assures himself that no one would have the audacity to visit his room at such a late hour, just as a hand reaches for his doorknob. A sudden knock at the door shatters Antonio's momentary peace, and he realizes with a jolt that someone is indeed outside. Startled, Antonio calls out, demanding to know who is at his door. A surge of panic grips Antonio as he frantically scrambles to reapply his chest bindings before opening the door. Antonio opens the door, expecting Alejandro, and begins to ask why he is so late. To Antonio's utter shock and dismay, the imposing figure of the Duke stands in his doorway. Antonio is visibly flustered and caught off guard, having fully anticipated Alejandro's arrival. The Duke calmly explains that Alejandro was unexpectedly called away on business, so he came in his stead, holding a sealed envelope. The Duke then raises an eyebrow, casually inquiring why Antonio is clutching a large, ornate vase filled with flowers. Antonio stammers an unconvincing excuse, claiming he was merely repositioning the vase due to dissatisfaction with its placement, an odd task for such a late hour. The Duke extends the envelope, stating it contains the 20 barangs he had promised to Antonio. Still encumbered by the heavy vase, Antonio explains his inability to take the envelope, as his hands are currently occupied. The Duke, with a hint of impatience, asks why Antonio doesn't simply set the vase down. Antonio, however, frantically refuses, insisting he has not yet decided on its new location. The Duke, his expression a mixture of mild exasperation and amusement, silently wonders what course of action he is expected to take. Antonio, desperate, subtly gestures with his head towards the blooms protruding from the top of the vase. He urgently pleads with the Duke to place the envelope among the flowers, internally lamenting the crushing weight of the vase. The Duke, looking thoroughly skeptical, confirms Antonio's unusual request to place the money atop the flowers in the vase. Antonio, forcing a strained smile, eagerly concurs, urging the Duke to act quickly. The Duke carefully places the envelope as requested, remarking that he anticipates seeing the impressive results Antonio had so confidently boasted about. Antonio hastily assures him he will not be disappointed. As the Duke turns to depart, Antonio calls out his name, stopping him. Still burdened by the vase, Antonio sheepishly requests that the Duke close the door on his way out, as his hands are clearly full. The moment the Duke departs, Antonio collapses in exhaustion, dramatically exclaiming that he will surely not survive to old age at this rate, his very soul seemingly trying to escape his body. At an elegant tea party, a group of noble ladies laugh amongst themselves, while Antonio stands rigidly and uncomfortably beside Lady Closet. Lady Closet beams in happy agreement with another lady's comment, while Antonio internally questions the series of events that led him to this awkward situation. The narrative flashes back to earlier that morning. Lady Closet had energetically approached Antonio, asking if he was prepared. Antonio, naturally, was utterly bewildered. Lady Closet, after confirming his name was indeed Antonio, had cheerfully and forcefully pulled him towards a waiting carriage, completely ignoring his attempts at protest. Antonio reflects on his inability to refuse the lady's command, ruefully acknowledging that the struggle to make a living has become unexpectedly complicated. During the tea party, one of the attending ladies remarks to Ms. Closet about her newly acquired and rather handsome Il Domestico. Lady Closet proudly gestures towards Antonio, prompting the ladies to agree on his handsomeness. The noblewomen enthusiastically concur, effusively praising Antonio's mysterious dark green hair. Their admiration continues unabated as they shower compliments on his mesmerizing emerald green eyes. The ladies also make sure to comment on his elegant jawline, all of which contributes to Antonio's growing discomfort. Lady Closet proudly elaborates that Antonio was formerly a nobleman, which accounts for his graceful bearing, so unlike common servants, adding he's so pretty he could be mistaken for a woman. Lady Closet turns to Antonio, seeking his affirmation of her statements. Antonio, maintaining his composure, politely confirms that her assertions are indeed correct. The ladies collectively swoon, captivated by what they perceive as Antonio's melodious voice. Antonio makes a pragmatic decision to play along with the charade, reasoning that these influential ladies could potentially become valuable investors in the future. One of the ladies draws the group's attention, asking them to look at an item she wishes to show. She presents an ornate floral hair accessory, explaining that her father acquired it from the Western Empire, though she herself is unsure of its precise nature. The lady observes that it doesn't resemble a necklace and seems too cumbersome to be a bracelet, a comment that piques Antonio's interest. She confesses her ignorance on how to properly use the accessory, at which point Antonio correctly identifies it as a hairbind. Antonio elaborates that while unfamiliar in their region, the hairbind is a highly popular hair ornament in the Rafelio's empire. With polite deference, Antonio offers to demonstrate the proper way to use the hairbind, causing the young lady to blush slightly. The lady is visibly delighted with the transformed hairstyle, declaring her love for it, as Antonio explains such styles are currently fashionable in Rafelio's. The other ladies at the party, impressed by the demonstration, eagerly clamor for Antonio to style their hair next, much to his thinly veiled dismay. Lady Closet firmly interjects, calling Antonio's name and effectively cutting short the other ladies' requests. Lady Closet decisively states that Antonio will now attend to her hair, to which he resigns himself with an internal sigh, agreeing. Antonio observes that Lady Closet appears to be in a genuinely good mood, humming contentedly as he arranges her hair. Lady Closet then turns her attention to Antonio, a thoughtful expression on her face, as she prepares to ask him something. She remarks on Antonio's rather peculiar skill in handling women's hair, a comment that causes him to pause. Antonio offers a plausible explanation. He frequently styled his younger sister's hair. Lady Closet expresses surprise, admitting she was unaware he had a sister. Antonio, adopting a mournful expression, informs Lady Closet that his beloved sister passed away not too long ago. He internally reflects on the considerable challenge of convincingly portraying the role of a grieving older brother. Lady Closet, her voice soft with genuine sympathy, gently utters Antonio's name, visibly moved by his feigned sorrow. Taking Antonio's hand, Lady Closet kindly offers that if he ever misses his sister, he is welcome to style her hair anytime he wishes. She passionately condemns the heartless, money-obsessed humans, whom she presumes caused Antonio such profound grief and hardship. As Lady Closet tearfully denounces these imagined tormentors as cold-hearted fiends, a pang of guilt begins to stir within Antonio over his elaborate deception. Lady Closet, composing herself, earnestly asks Antonio about the extent of his debt, offering her assistance and assuring him of a generous salary. Antonio demurs, suggesting the debt is too substantial for her to handle, but Lady Closet insists, proudly proclaiming her wealth. Antonio reluctantly reveals the staggering sum of 5,000 barangs, a figure that visibly shocks Lady Closet into stunned silence. Lady Closet stammers, finding it hard to believe the amount, and asks for confirmation. Antonio internally notes that 5,000 barangs is indeed a fortune, even for a noble. Antonio explains that after selling a portion of the estate, he managed to pay off some, but still owes approximately 3,200 barangs. He quickly adds he has a solution. Lady Closet, her resolve rekindled, proposes a deal. Antonio will serve as her il domestico for 3 days a week. She confidently promises to ensure his salary will be more than sufficient to cover his debts. An offer Antonio gratefully accepts. Antonio reflects that while Closet was a minor character in the original novel, her unexpected kindness makes him feel as though he has gained a younger sister. Closet then adds a small, playful condition about him always being available to do her hair. Lady Closet then turns to Antonio and offers a sincere apology. Antonio is understandably confused and asks what she is apologizing for. Lady Closet voices her profound frustration with her brother, the Duke, questioning how he can be so fixated on money, even with family. She formally apologizes to Antonio on behalf of the entire duchy for her brother's callous behavior. Antonio attempts to reassure Lady Closet that an apology is unnecessary, but she firmly insists that her brother's actions are wrong. Lady Closet confidently predicts that her brother's relentless pursuit of wealth and disregard for others will inevitably lead to serious consequences for him someday. Antonio thoughtfully points out that Lady Closet seems to be quite alone, with only her brother for family. Lady Closet quickly reassures Antonio, promising her protection as long as he is with her, emphasizing his status as her personal servant. Antonio, visibly touched by her sincerity and protectiveness, readily accepts her offer with a grateful "yes, lady." Upon returning to Duke Balthazar's imposing residence, Lady Closet cheerfully calls out to Antonio. Lady Closet extends a spontaneous invitation for Antonio to join her for dinner, prompting him to question the propriety of a mere servant dining with her. Lady Closet dismisses his concerns with a wave of her hand, confidently asserting that he is also a noble, regardless of his current predicament. As Lady Closet begins to lead Antonio towards the dining hall, the Duke's unexpected appearance halts them in their tracks. The Duke, his voice dripping with sarcasm, remarks on Antonio's apparent abundance of free time, startling Antonio. The Duke's voice takes on a menacing tone as he questions whether Antonio has already managed to gather the 500 barangs, sarcastically implying he has too much leisure time if he can squire Closet around. Antonio silently fumes, exasperated by the Duke's consistently grating and provocative demeanor. Antonio calmly reminds the Duke of their agreed-upon time frame, stating that he was given 2 months to procure the funds. The Duke concedes the point, but delivers a chilling warning. Antonio will find it nearly impossible to gather the sum within the remaining time, even if he were to start his efforts immediately. Antonio, maintaining an air of nonchalance, advises the Duke not to worry, explaining that as a servant, he was in no position to refuse the lady's request. With a quick, almost dismissive bow, Antonio cheerfully bids the Duke farewell, a display of breezy confidence that clearly annoys the Duke. Antonio internally scoffs at the Duke's intimidating glare, resolute in his determination not to be swindled or unnerved. Lady Closet's urgent cry of Antonio's name cuts through the tension as she rushes towards him with evident concern. Antonio flinches, a sudden jolt of pain or shock coursing through him, and mutters an apology. He tries to laugh it off, despairing that nothing ever seems to go smoothly for him. Lady Closet and Alejandro hurry to Antonio's side, their faces etched with worry at his pained expression, anxiously asking if he is injured. The Duke, observing the commotion with a detached air, coolly advises Antonio to be more careful, while Antonio insists he is fine and offers another apology. Antonio, clearly uncomfortable and eager to escape the scrutiny, suggests he should probably go and change his clothes. Lady Closet looks on, frustrated by the turn of events. The Duke, his gaze fixed on Antonio, directly asks if he is injured. The Duke then pointedly observes that Antonio is wearing a bandage. The Duke presses his inquiry, asking Antonio if he sustained an injury, which causes Antonio to flinch and hesitate with his response. With a steely gaze, the Duke logically questions the presence of the bandage if Antonio claims not to be hurt. Panic floods Antonio's mind as he desperately tries to concoct a plausible explanation for the conspicuous bandage. Lady Closet quickly intervenes, decisively stating that Antonio's injury is her fault. She elaborates, fabricating a story about slipping while disembarking from the carriage earlier, claiming Antonio hurt his back in the process of catching her. The Duke appears to accept this explanation, though Antonio internally scoffs at the sheer audacity of the lie. A wave of gratitude washes over Antonio as he mentally thanks Closet for her quick thinking and intervention. Antonio briefly wonders if Closet might have discerned his secret, as she offers an apology to the Duke on Antonio's behalf, attributing his supposed injury to her clumsiness. Antonio is flustered by Closet's apology for him, while the Duke, turning his attention to his sister, inquires if she too was injured in the alleged incident. Closet responds with a dismissive scoff, questioning since when her brother has shown any concern for her safety or well-being. The Duke abruptly addresses Antonio by name, his tone causing Antonio to startle. The Duke advises Antonio to exercise caution and avoid overexerting his body. He then delivers a chilling reminder: Antonio's body is not his own until the substantial debt is fully repaid. Antonio nervously acknowledges this, while Closet fumes at her brother's words. Closet expresses her deep frustration at her brother's ability to unsettle Antonio so profoundly with just a single, cutting remark, admitting she dislikes it intensely. Antonio turns to Closet, a genuine question in his eyes, asking why she chose to help him with the lie. Closet offers a simple, disarming explanation. She helped because Antonio appeared to be genuinely worried. Antonio is visibly taken aback, touched by the straightforward kindness of her reason. Closet reaffirms her intention to protect Antonio from her cold-blooded brother, even as Antonio points out her ignorance regarding the true reason for his bandages. Antonio quietly poses a question, wondering if the reason for the bandages truly matters to her. Closet thoughtfully considers his words, suggesting that perhaps he bears scars, physical or emotional, that he prefers not to reveal. She concludes that, regardless of the cause, it's evident he has endured hardship, her empathy making Antonio feel a warmth spread through him. Closet then reminds Antonio of an upcoming tea party for the Marquisa's daughter, instructing him that his only duty will be to stand by her side and look handsome, an instruction to which he readily agrees. Alejandro, noticing Antonio's damp clothes from the earlier mishap, urges him to change quickly to prevent catching a cold. Antonio arrives in the quaint, picturesque town of Algricia, ready to enact his plan. Stepping down from the carriage, Antonio expresses his gratitude to the driver. Antonio stands resolutely in the heart of Algricia's town square, his mind set on discovering his first valuable painting. He recalls a crucial detail from the novel. The female protagonist discovers her initial significant artwork in this very village, launching her career as a patron of unknown artists. Antonio scans his surroundings, his eyes searching for any indication of artists or vendors selling paintings. A friendly fishmonger attempts to capture his attention with her fresh wares, but Antonio remains politely focused on his primary objective. Antonio continues his search through the marketplace, a flicker of concern appearing as he fails to locate any artists selling their work. He begins to wonder why no one is present, and if he has perhaps misjudged the timing. An elderly woman approaches and kindly asks if he is searching for something. Antonio politely inquires of the old woman if there is anyone in the village who sells paintings. She thoughtfully asks if he might be referring to Abel. The old woman's expression turns somber as she informs Antonio that it has been quite some time since she last saw Abel. Antonio is visibly shocked by this news and urgently asks for the reason behind Abel's absence, but the old woman confesses she does not know. The old woman suggests that if Antonio's curiosity is truly piqued, he should visit Abel's house directly. She provides a peculiar detail. Antonio should look for a rose of a specific size, which ought to be affixed to Abel's door. He recognizes the rose flower drawing, a specific detail from his knowledge. He wonders if the person he seeks is inside this rustic house. He cautiously approaches the door, calling out to see if anyone is present. A sense of dread washes over him as he considers the possibility of events unfolding according to the original, unfavorable narrative. Convinced Mr. Abel is inside, he pounds on the door, urgently pleading for him to open it. The door opens, revealing a man who questions his disruptive actions, leaving him momentarily speechless. Artist Abel Huntham sternly confronts him, demanding to know why he was banging on his door so aggressively. His attention is immediately captivated by a painting within the house, a specific image that jolts him with recognition. He exclaims internally, recognizing the artwork as the one described, confirming he has found the correct location and the princess's first collection. Composing himself, he politely inquires if the man before him is indeed Mr. Abel Huntham. He explains that a chance encounter with Mr. Abel's artwork prompted this personal visit, while Abel listens with a reserved expression. Just as Antonio begins to introduce himself, Abel abruptly slams the door in his face. Antonio is left bewildered and sweating, wondering if the protagonist has already acquired what he sought. Frustrated, Antonio pounds on the door again, accusing Abel of discrimination and insisting they talk. As he turns from the door, he is surprised to see a small girl standing nearby. He crouches down to her level, gently asking if this is her home. With a kind smile, he inquires why she is outside by herself. The girl shyly explains her mother's warning about strangers, making Antonio momentarily realize his adult male presence might be intimidating. Seeing her fear, Antonio quickly apologizes for frightening her and offers to leave immediately. He pauses, puzzled by her continued presence despite her apparent fear. A feeling of unease settles in as Antonio considers the peculiarities of the situation. He notes the dilapidated state of the house, suggesting it hasn't been cared for in a while. His heart aches as he concludes the little girl is likely neglected. They have finally reached their destination, a quaint town. Alejandro seems perplexed by the Duke's statement about arriving at Algrecia, seeking clarification. The Duke stands resolute as Alejandro questions the motive behind establishing a school in what appears to be a minor town. The Duke corrects Alejandro's assessment, hinting that the town holds more significance than its size suggests, surprising his companion. He elaborates on the town's crucial role as a trade hub between the capital and the duchy, predicting its future growth. With an academy for nobles already existing, the Duke's plan is to establish an educational institution for the middle and common classes. Alejandro expresses admiration for the Duke's strategic thinking, to which the Duke confidently replies it stems from his consistent academic excellence. Meanwhile, Antonio decides his first stop in town will be the marketplace. Contemplating his disguise, Antonio realizes that wigs offer a straightforward solution to his problem. He ponders the key difference he needs to address to convincingly impersonate the lady. Now in disguise, Antonio encounters the little girl again, who tentatively calls out, mistaking him for her mother. The girl, Erlin, rushes towards Antonio, joyfully shouting for her mom, while Abel looks on in stunned disbelief. Erlin embraces Antonio tightly, her cries of "Mom" echoing with desperate longing. Abel rushes out, apologizing and frantically trying to explain to Erlin that Antonio isn't her mother. Abel appears exhausted by the situation, while Antonio has a silent realization about the crucial distinction between himself and the lady he's impersonating. The pivotal difference, he understands, is simply gender. Erlin wails in her father's arms, and Abel apologizes to Antonio, explaining his recent bereavement. Antonio, maintaining his persona, offers a gentle smile and reassures Abel that it's all right, understanding the difficult circumstances. As Antonio anticipated, about a month later, Abel encounters him again in the market, still disguised as the lady. It becomes clear that Abel had been seeing a resemblance of his late wife in the lady. Antonio recalls choosing a blonde wig specifically to match the lady's hair color, which inadvertently caused Erlin to mistake him for her mother. Antonio gently asks Erlin if he resembles her mother, and the child hesitates, scrutinizing him. After a moment, Erlin firmly states that this person is not her mother. Antonio apologizes for causing the misunderstanding, and Erlin quietly accepts the apology. Erlin reveals a key detail. Her mother has beautiful blue eyes, a fact Antonio registers with understanding. Erlin innocently asks her father when her mother will return, a question that visibly pains Abel. Abel begins to offer a hopeful, yet vague, response to Erlin's question, while Antonio observes the poignant scene. Abel expresses his regret to Antonio for witnessing their private grief, but Antonio dismisses it with empathy, acknowledging their difficult time. Abel then curiously inquires about the reason for Antonio's visit, noting he seems out of place in their neighborhood. Antonio internally admits he hadn't considered the personal circumstances, his mind solely focused on acquiring a painting. Abel directly asks if Antonio is there to purchase his artwork, leaving Antonio surprised at how quickly he deduced his intention. Abel remarks on the rarity of such visits, and correctly assumes Antonio is connected to the man who was just there. Seeing Antonio's affable demeanor, Abel invites him inside to discuss the matter further. Abel apologizes for the humble condition of his home as they sit, though he notes the tea is fragrant. Abel perceptively notes Antonio's admiration for the painting, and Antonio readily confirms his interest. Abel inquires about the lady's connection to the man named Antonio who was at his door earlier, and she claims he is her older brother. Abel seems relieved, apparently not suspecting the lady and Antonio are the same person, as Erlin contentedly eats her bread. Abel reiterates that his wife's passing was recent, a heavy backdrop to their conversation, while Erlin continues to eat. Abel confides that the cherished painting is his final piece of art, after which he stopped painting and isolated himself. He explains that witnessing Erlin's earlier interaction with the lady brought him a new understanding, though Erlin herself looks puzzled. Antonio reflects that he wasn't alone in his struggles. Others were enduring their own hardships. Antonio empathizes deeply, realizing the child, Erlin, must be suffering even more profoundly. Abel acknowledges with regret that his own grief had blinded him to his daughter's suffering. After his realization, Abel turns to Antonio and makes a firm decision. He will sell the painting. Antonio, taken aback by the sudden offer, questions if Abel is certain, recognizing the painting's immense sentimental value. Abel confesses he has been too selfish, becoming ensnared by the memories the painting held, a sentiment his daughter's innocent question seems to highlight. He laments his foolishness, reminding himself that, despite its significance, it is ultimately just an object. With newfound resolve, Abel decides to focus on his daughter's well-being, planning to use the sale proceeds to provide a better life for her. He believes this decision aligns with what his late wife would have wished, and Erlin smiles contentedly at his touch. Abel expresses gratitude towards both the lady and her brother Antonio, crediting them with helping him find clarity, which surprises Antonio. Antonio muses that Abel would have likely come to this realization eventually, especially after their fated meeting in the market. He feels he can guarantee one thing. Antonio confidently assures Abel that his artistic talent will soon gain recognition, a prediction Abel finds hard to believe. Antonio explains his certainty stems from the undeniable quality of Abel's art, predicting widespread appreciation for its value. He paints a future where Abel achieves great success as an artist, even gaining royal patronage, declaring this is merely the start of his journey. Satisfied with the purchase, Antonio takes the painting and departs, ready for the next step. Lost in thought, Antonio collides with the Duke, quickly apologizing. The Duke, concerned, asks if he is injured. Antonio is utterly stunned to find the Duke and his retinue unexpectedly present in the same location. The Duke reiterates his concern for Antonio's well-being, while his aide looks on, puzzled by the encounter. Panic sets in as Antonio realizes the dire implications of the Duke seeing him in his female disguise, wondering desperately how to handle the situation. The Duke questions why Antonio is hiding his face with the painting, but Antonio remains silent, flustered. The Duke offers assistance, still assuming Antonio might be hurt from their collision. Antonio makes a swift escape. The aide, perplexed by the lady's speed, asks the Duke if he recognized her, but the Duke offers a noncommittal response. A flicker of suspicion crosses the Duke's mind, but he quickly dismisses it as impossible, leaving his aide bewildered. The Duke explains that the lady's eyes merely reminded him of someone else, as Antonio disappears from view. The setting transitions to the grand estate of Duke Balthazar. Antonio, now dressed as himself, cautiously observes a room and sighs in relief, finding everything apparently normal. He sighs, lamenting the unfortunate timing of his encounter with the Duke while he was in disguise. Antonio wonders about the Duke's whereabouts, only to turn and find him unexpectedly present. The Duke directly asks if Antonio requires his attention, startling Antonio with his sudden appearance. Flustered, Antonio quickly and awkwardly denies having any business with the Duke. The Duke remarks that it's unfortunate Antonio has no business, because he, in fact, has matters to discuss with Antonio. The Duke summons Antonio into his office. Antonio, visibly terrified by the command, reluctantly complies. Inside the Duke's imposing office, Antonio apprehensively inquires about the purpose of their meeting. The Duke cuts straight to a chilling topic, questioning Antonio about his younger sister, Roselia de Hessink, whom Antonio had claimed was deceased. Antonio is visibly shocked. Antonio, caught off guard and stammering, questions the Duke's sudden interest in his late sister. The Duke reveals he encountered someone earlier that day who bore a striking resemblance to Antonio, causing Antonio to tense up. The Duke pauses, indicating he has another crucial point to make, heightening the suspense. The Duke leans closer, questioning Antonio's lack of perfume today, while Antonio becomes aware of the Duke's own distinct scent. The Duke internally confirms that the scent is identical to the one worn by the woman he encountered earlier. Antonio, meanwhile, is trying to place the familiar yet unsettling scent emanating from the Duke. Feigning ignorance, Antonio claims he doesn't comprehend the Duke's insinuations. The Duke presses further, asking directly if Roselia de Hessink is indeed dead, causing Antonio to clench his fist in anxiety. Antonio internally panics, fearing exposure, as the Duke sternly demands a truthful response. The Duke outlines severe repercussions if Antonio falsely reported his sister's death while hiding her, a charge Antonio vehemently denies. As the Duke reiterates the grave consequences of deceit, Antonio internally frets, wondering if the Duke suspects his true gender. Antonio internally concedes a point, acknowledging the truth in the Duke's nature or the situation. He reflects on the Duke's consistent nature, recognizing this intimidating demeanor as characteristic of him. Antonio remembers the Duke's ruthlessness, how he exploited Roselia's love for him only to cast her aside. The grim memory of Roselia's ultimate fate, execution by guillotine, flashes through Antonio's mind. Antonio accuses the Duke of being unreasonable, a statement the Duke questions with a simple sound. The Duke coldly dismisses Antonio's claim of grief, reminding him they are not blood siblings. Antonio clarifies their history. His mother remarried into a baron's family, making Roselia his stepsister. Antonio asserts that their lack of blood relation means they wouldn't resemble each other, an explanation the Duke appears to accept. The Duke concedes that he may have been mistaken in his suspicions. The Duke offers a curt apology and dismisses Antonio, who bows respectfully before departing. As Antonio leaves, the Duke clenches his fist, still pondering the possibility that Antonio's story was a performance. He muses that if Antonio's demeanor was merely an act, it was a commendable one. The Duke silently reflects, considering if the familiar scent had made him unusually suspicious. Once clear of the Duke's office, Antonio collapses in sheer relief, exclaiming that he somehow survived the intense questioning. As he crawls away, shaken, Antonio reflects on the Duke's callous threat of consequences, reaffirming his decision to fake Roselia's death. Despite the ordeal, Antonio clutches the painting with a triumphant smile, his focus shifting to selling it. Antonio now faces the challenge of selling the painting, his thoughts turning to how he might approach the crown princess. He despairs over his lowly status as a servant, unsure how to gain an audience with the crown princess, when Closet notices his worried expression. Closet earnestly offers assistance, playfully reminding Antonio that he's meant to be looking his best today. Antonio is flustered by Closet's overly enthusiastic compliment, while she presses him, asking if he doubts her ability to help. He thanks her, but expresses doubt due to the difficulty of his goal, meeting the crown princess to settle his debt. Closet casually dismisses his concerns as trivial, suggesting a surprisingly simple, if vague, approach to presenting the painting. Closet then strategically asks Antonio if he knows the location of that day's tea party. The answer is revealed. The tea party is being hosted at the Marquisate, the family estate of the crown princess. Ikelia de Herden, younger sister to the crown princess, admires her own beauty while Antonio attends to her. Ikelia and her companion openly admire Antonio's dexterity and good looks. Another lady, Jucid de Belmont, scoffs dismissively at the others fawning over Antonio's rare handsomeness. Jucid internally expresses her preference for more traditionally masculine men. Jucid voices her disdain, questioning Antonio's capability as a servant due to his perceived frailty, while Closet remains silent. Jucid, identified as from the Marquis Belmont family, continues her critical assessment, thinking Antonio appears exceedingly delicate. Antonio is visibly angered by Jucid's insult, but Closet quickly intervenes, attempting to placate him. Antonio, ever composed, introduces himself and courteously offers to adjust Lady Jucid's hair. Lady Jucid reacts with flustered surprise, blushing, while Antonio internally notes his strategy for dealing with her type. Antonio expertly flatters Lady Jucid by praising her face shape and suggesting an updo, shrewdly observing that critical people often crave positive attention. Lady Jucid, swayed by the compliment, hesitantly allows him to proceed, much to Ikelia's amazement at Antonio's calming influence. Closet chimes in, further praising Antonio by highlighting his exceptional sense of aesthetics, piquing Aechilia's curiosity. Antonio expertly styles Lady Jucid's hair, his skillful touch seemingly appreciated by the once critical lady, while Closet internally cheers him on. Closet falsely boasts about Antonio's supposed interest in drawing and his keen eye for art, even claiming untruthfully that the Duke himself recognizes it, much to Jucid's astonishment. Antonio smoothly transitions the conversation, inquiring if the Crown Princess shares an interest in painting. Aechelia confirms this, mentioning recent invitations to artists. However, Aechelia notes that her sister hasn't yet found any artwork that has truly captivated her. Seizing the opportunity, Closet suggests that Antonio knows of a painting that might appeal to the Crown Princess, and Aechelia expresses interest in seeing it. Aechelia eagerly agrees to the idea and enthusiastically vows to inform the Crown Princess about it. The narrative moves to the majestic imperial palace. Antonio is ecstatic, reflecting that after 3 long years, he will finally have his audience with the Crown Princess. A court attendant announces the arrival of Duke Balthazar's servant, and the Crown Princess grants him entry. Antonio nervously enters the chamber, clutching the painting, aware that the story's heroine is within. The Crown Princess greets him and confirms his name is Antonio. Antonio respectfully affirms his identity before Her Highness, the Crown Princess. Crown Princess Ivline de Lugbelzit, a regal figure, expresses her anticipation to see what Antonio has brought. Antonio is visibly dazzled by the Crown Princess's beauty, internally acknowledging her as the heroine, before she addresses him by name. Overwhelmed, Antonio bows deeply, expressing how honored he feels to be in her presence. Internally ecstatic about meeting the heroine, Antonio is gently told by the Crown Princess to raise his head. The Crown Princess explains that Closet, whom she regards as a little sister, spoke so highly of the painting that her curiosity was piqued. With some nervousness, Antonio presents the wrapped painting to the Crown Princess. An agonizing silence follows, making Antonio increasingly anxious as he awaits her reaction. The Crown Princess's attention is solely on the unveiled artwork before her. She observes that the painting exudes a genuine warmth. She remarks that she can almost feel the emotions of the subject depicted within the artwork. The Crown Princess inquires about the artist, and Antonio, internally celebrating, proudly reveals the name Abel Huntam. She thanks Antonio for bringing such a remarkable piece to her attention, and Antonio expresses his profound honor. The Crown Princess then states she has a request for Antonio, leaving him to wonder what it might be. She explains that her restricted mobility makes it difficult for her to seek out paintings she loves, despite her passion for art. Her confinement to the palace is the primary reason she cannot easily acquire the art she desires. Trusting his artistic judgment, the Crown Princess formally requests Antonio to find and present her with excellent art pieces, promising fair compensation. Antonio enthusiastically accepts her commission to procure fine art for her in the future. Before discussing future acquisitions, the Crown Princess moves to address the payment for Abel's painting. Antonio is overjoyed, confident that he successfully catered to the Crown Princess's preferences. Antonio is stunned to receive 1,000 barang, double the amount he anticipated based on the original story, wondering if the sum is a mistake. The Crown Princess clarifies the generous sum is for both the painting and as an advance for Antonio's services, with separate funds allocated for sponsoring Abel, which Antonio is to deliver. A hopeful thought strikes Antonio. This unexpected income and future arrangement could allow him to clear his debt much sooner. Antonio eagerly reaffirms his commitment to their arrangement, just as the sound of approaching footsteps interrupts them. An attendant announces the unexpected arrival of His Highness the Crown Prince, startling both Antonio and the Crown Princess. The Crown Prince strides in without prior notice, his late-night arrival clearly unsettling the Crown Princess. The Crown Princess formally acknowledges his presence, while Antonio stands by, understandably nervous. Antonio recalls the description of the Crown Prince: striking blonde hair, golden eyes, and a notoriously fierce temperament. This is the man known as the Crown Princess's tormentor, a figure who, according to the original story, only showed remorse at the brink of his own downfall. The Crown Prince claims his visit was to inquire about Closet's well-being, a statement the Crown Princess clearly finds suspect. Antonio is baffled that the Crown Prince would summon him, a duke's servant, merely to ask after a noblewoman, immediately suspecting the Crown Princess of some underlying plot. Crown Prince Esteban Vandeloup de Lugbelzit wastes no time, accusing the Crown Princess of clandestine dealings with Duke Balthazar's family. The narrative labels Crown Prince Esteban as a psycho male protagonist, hinting at his dangerous and unstable nature. A flashback reveals that Klaus, Duke Balthazar, and the Crown Princess were once close childhood friends. In their youth, their bond was incredibly strong. They were inseparable companions. However, their close relationship began to deteriorate with the rise and influence of the Crown Prince. Their relationship eventually devolved into such animosity that they appeared unable to tolerate each other's presence. The Crown Prince reiterates his suspicion, demanding to know what scheme the Crown Princess is concocting with the Duke's family behind his back. The Crown Princess maintains her innocent explanation about inquiring after closet, but the Crown Prince remains deeply skeptical. He voices his paranoia, suggesting that her family, the Marquis household, and the Balthazar ducal family could be conspiring against him. The Crown Princess, incensed by his accusations, sharply rebukes him. The Crown Prince cruelly interprets her anger as a sign of guilt, while Antonio desperately pleads for them to cease their escalating argument. The Crown Prince makes a venomous insinuation, asking if she intends to drive him to suicide as he implies her mother did, shocking Antonio. She retorts that she is not so easily broken, a familiar, painful exchange that Antonio recognizes from the original narrative. Antonio observes the toxic dynamic, recalling how such escalating doubts and misunderstandings in the story invariably led to disaster. Antonio internally braces for Klaus's arrival, which historically only exacerbated such situations, while outwardly pleading for the Rials to desist. As if on cue, Duke Klaus Balthazar appears, coolly observing the tense scene and posing a cryptic question. Antonio internally despairs at their impeccable, or rather, terrible timing, wishing they would conduct their volatile arguments when he wasn't present. The Crown Prince greets the Duke with sarcastic familiarity, likening his arrival to an ill-omened apparition. The Crown Prince observes the unfolding drama with a smirk, clearly finding the confrontation entertaining. He sardonically comments that witnessing the Duke and Crown Princess together almost makes him feel like he's the one in the wrong. Klaus curtly tells the Crown Prince to stop, stating the Crown Princess is distressed, an intervention the prince perceives as an order. Antonio wishes they'd argue elsewhere. The Crown Princess, pushed to her limit, shouts for both of them to cease their hostilities. She threatens to boycott an important diplomatic event if they continue, a move the Crown Prince scoffs at as unbecoming of her station. The Crown Prince strategically concedes, acknowledging that her absence at the diplomatic event would indeed be a significant problem. Before departing, the Crown Prince delivers a chilling threat to Duke Balthazar, warning of dire consequences for his family should their paths cross again. Once the Crown Prince leaves, Klaus turns to the Crown Princess, inquiring if she still endures such careless treatment from her fiancé. The Crown Princess sharply rebuffs him, insisting that her relationship with the Crown Prince is a private affair and no concern of his. Antonio enthusiastically agrees with the Crown Princess, his outburst catching Klaus by surprise. Klaus finally notices Antonio, questioning his presence. Antonio stammers a greeting, internally remarking on the Duke's delayed observation. The Crown Princess explains she summoned Antonio to inquire about closet, a convenient cover for her true purpose of art collecting, which Antonio perceives she wishes to keep from the Duke. Klaus, clearly irritated, addresses Antonio with a pointed question, asking if he only departs when explicitly dismissed. Antonio quickly offers to leave, assuring the Duke his wrist is fine, though Klaus still seems subtly concerned about it. Safely away, Antonio expresses his utter disbelief at the chaotic series of events he just witnessed and endured. He fumes over the Duke's audacity, particularly his implication that Antonio wouldn't leave without permission, questioning the absurdity of it. Antonio attempts to erase the recent turmoil from his mind, only to be intercepted by the Crown Prince. Thoroughly exasperated, Antonio retorts he's going home, muttering about the unwelcome attention from these annoying pests. Antonio quickly adopts a servile demeanor towards the Crown Prince, who greets his feigned deference with a blunt threat. The Crown Prince contemptuously refers to Antonio as Balthazar's dog, and declares he has questions, an insult Antonio internally bristles at. The Crown Prince grabs Antonio, dragging him towards a more secluded area suitable for private and likely unpleasant, conversation. In distress, Antonio begs the crown prince to release him so they can speak, though he suspects his plea is futile. Having found a private spot, the crown prince demands to know what tasks the duke assigned Antonio, suspecting espionage. The crown prince offers to spare Antonio's life in exchange for honest answers, but Antonio defiantly refuses to cooperate. Seeing Antonio's defiance, the crown prince's demeanor turns more threatening, prompting a terrified Antonio to beg for his life. The crown prince then attempts bribery, offering to double whatever payment Antonio received from the duke, surprising Antonio. The crown prince ups the ante to triple the amount, insisting Antonio reveal the duke's secrets. Antonio briefly contemplates betraying the duke. Despite the tempting offer, Antonio respectfully declines, maintaining he was merely running an errand for the duke, and asks to be believed. The crown prince remains skeptical, but Antonio insists on his truthfulness, claiming he lacks the strength or cunning for elaborate schemes. The crown prince seizes Antonio's wrist, remarking on its surprising thinness. He reflects that, upon closer consideration, Antonio's delicate build is indeed peculiar. The crown prince observes that Antonio is unusually short and slender for man, a comment that alarms Antonio. The crown prince insistently asks for Antonio's name. A memory surfaces of Roselia, weary and defeated, beginning to state her name under similar duress. In the flashback, Roselia identifies herself to the crown prince, who repeats her name with a questioning tone. The crown prince then cruelly declared that the name Roselia was unsuitable for someone he considered a traitor's accomplice. His judgment was swift and brutal. He ordered her execution, leaving Roselia aghast. As guards dragged her away, Roselia desperately cried out for her lord, Duke Balthazar, to save her. Back in the present, the crown prince repeats his demand for Antonio's name, the narrative underscoring that he was the one who ultimately condemned Roselia. It is unequivocally stated that Crown Prince Esteban was responsible for Roselia's death. He then coldly asks Antonio if he has lost his composure. Roselia's crime was smuggling information from the Crown Prince's palace under the Duke's orders, a betrayal that led her to the guillotine. Antonio tenses, reliving the trauma. Composing himself, Antonio finally states his name is Antonio, to which the Crown Prince mockingly replies it's a wonderful name. The Crown Prince then declares the name Antonio doesn't suit him, but Antonio internally resolves that he can still avoid Roselia's tragic fate. The Crown Prince continues his probing about Antonio's physique. Antonio attributes his thinness to a starved upbringing, privately noting the original story's deviations. The Crown Prince then questions Antonio's short stature, a remark Antonio finds particularly grating as it targets his deepest insecurity. Seemingly satisfied or bored, the Crown Prince dismisses Antonio, who readily agrees to leave. As he walks away, Antonio makes a fervent vow. He will absolutely not suffer the same fate as Roselia. The narrative returns to the familiar setting of Duke Balthazar's grand estate. Antonio presents a sum of 1,000 barang to Duke Balthazar, explicitly stating it is double their agreed-upon amount, clearly surprising the Duke. Antonio declares he has fulfilled his promise, with a hint of smug satisfaction that the Duke likely doubted his ability to procure the funds. He expects the Duke to be thoroughly impressed by his success, as the Duke begins to inspect the contents of the envelope. The Duke acknowledges the payment, but wastes no time in questioning Antonio about his recent visit to the Crown Princess's palace. Antonio is clearly not expecting this line of questioning. The Duke, unimpressed by the money, demands the real reason for the visit, warning against flimsy excuses. The Duke presses Antonio for a clear explanation of his motives for approaching the Crown Princess. The Duke sternly warns Antonio against manipulating or using the Crown Princess, to which Antonio defiantly questions if he is forbidden from doing so. The Duke is momentarily stunned by Antonio's audacity. Antonio firmly states that how he chooses to repay his debts is his own affair. Antonio boldly suggests that, ultimately, the Duke's only concern is the repayment of the money owed to him. Enraged, the Duke seizes Antonio, who quickly reassures him that he has no intention of harming the Crown Princess. Antonio advises the Duke to cease overthinking the situation, claiming his suspicions are making things unnecessarily awkward. Antonio promises to disappear once his debt is settled, while the Duke continues to glare at him, unconvinced. Antonio directly challenges the Duke, pointedly asking if he is forbidding him from any involvement with the Crown Princess. Antonio cornered by Klaus's accusations of using Roselia, desperately pleads for understanding and release. Defiantly, Antonio retorts that Klaus failed to protect Roselia when she faced execution due to Klaus's own actions. Antonio coldly vows that should Klaus ever face a death sentence for treason, he will offer no aid whatsoever. Furthermore, Antonio declares he would find satisfaction in Klaus's downfall, believing it to be deserved. With conviction, Antonio tells Klaus that his obsession with the crown princess will be his undoing, sealing his fate. Closet playfully presents a mask to Antonio, eager for his opinion and clearly excited for an upcoming event. Antonio dismisses the mask as unsuitable for his taste, prompting Closet to quickly suggest other options, while Melda observes. Closet, noticing Antonio's troubled look, inquires about it, but Antonio feigns ignorance, questioning her concern. Closet bluntly remarks that Antonio appears burdened, like a young noble overwhelmed by debt, an observation Antonio internally concedes is accurate. Holding up another mask, Closet shrewdly asks Antonio what new trouble Klaus has caused him, making Antonio marvel at her sharp intuition. Melda advises Antonio to disregard the past, noting Klaus's tendency to become unpleasant when the crown princess is involved. As a selection of masks is shown, Closet, holding a vibrant mask, cheerfully suggests that one might as well embrace a messy situation and try to enjoy it. Antonio, slightly flustered, acknowledges Closet's wisdom as she turns, suggesting a different mask would suit him better. Closet then holds out a blue mask, inviting a hesitant-looking Antonio to try it on. Antonio declines, citing his current attire and the mask's feminine design, but Closet brightly insists he simply change his outfit to match. With a look of sheer discomfort, Antonio firmly rejects the idea, making his aversion quite clear. Closet teases Antonio for his refusal, wondering aloud how pretty he would look in women's attire after all she has done for him. Seeking an ally, Closet appeals to Melda, who readily encourages Antonio to try on a dress just once. Resigned and embarrassed, Antonio reluctantly agrees, much to Closet's squealing delight. Now clad in a frilly dress and wig, Antonio inwardly bemoans this recurring, absurd predicament. Transformed and masked, Antonio, looking surprisingly convincing as a woman, anxiously hopes the ordeal is finally over. Closet and Melda are visibly thrilled with Antonio's new appearance, expressing their enthusiastic approval. Closet passionately wishes Antonio had been born a lady, even wanting his portrait done, while a flustered Antonio mutters about the wrong surname. Closet muses that black hair would suit Antonio better than the blonde wig, as he nervously endures her examination. Closet, full of zeal, showers an already masked and overwhelmed Antonio with even more masks to try. Laden with masks, Antonio expresses his confusion at the sudden abundance, and Closet's intense focus on them. Closet reminds Antonio of her upcoming masquerade birthday ball, to which the crown princess is also invited, piquing Antonio's curiosity about the dresses. Excitedly, Closet announces Antonio will attend her party, prompting a disguised Antonio to anxiously ask if he'll be a servant. Closet firmly declares Antonio will be her guest, leaving him shocked and protesting it's a bad idea. Closet dismisses Antonio's concerns, arguing a mask will ensure his anonymity, but he remains silently apprehensive. Still in the dress, Antonio begs to change before being seen, but Closet vehemently objects, wanting to prolong the charade. Closet questions if Antonio even owns a suitable suit, to which Antonio, back in his usual clothes, suggests his current attire is fine. Closet, flanked by maids, emphatically rejects Antonio's suggestion with a look of stern disapproval. To Antonio's utter surprise, Closet announces he will attend as her partner, not merely a servant. Closet bursts into gleeful, mischievous laughter, clearly pleased with her plan and Antonio's stunned reaction. Blushing and uneasy, Antonio endures being measured by maids, silently questioning Closet's perplexing behavior. A servant announces a gift from the Duke, startling Closet, who questions receiving anything from that man. Closet scoffs at Klaus's early birthday gift, interpreting it as another excuse for his absence due to busyness, as Antonio observes. Antonio reminds Closet that the party is also her debutante ball, and pointedly asks if she truly expects Klaus to attend. Closet asserts Antonio doesn't understand Klaus, describing him as a cold man, indifferent to family matters. She elaborates that Klaus is consumed by work and money, a statement punctuated by the image of an ornate gift box. Closet sadly recounts Klaus's consistent absence from her birthdays and their parents' memorials, her resignation evident to a sympathetic Antonio. Antonio internally wishes Closet wouldn't misinterpret or dwell on her brother's behavior, feeling concerned for her. Antonio announces himself to Duke Klaus, who, with a serious demeanor, reluctantly grants him entry. Recalling their recent tense exchange, Antonio feels an overwhelming awkwardness in Klaus's presence now. Klaus impatiently asks Antonio if he intends to just stand there. Flustered, Antonio conveys Closet's thanks for the gift, which Klaus curtly acknowledges. Klaus perceptively notes that Antonio seems to have something more to say, his own expression inscrutable. Nervously clutching a small case, Antonio admits he has something brief to give Klaus. Klaus examines the mask Antonio presented, his expression a mixture of curiosity and perhaps suspicion. Antonio explains the party's masquerade theme, mentioning he thought Klaus might be unaware. Klaus, without looking up from his work, dryly states he knows, as it's the ducal budget's largest recent expense. Antonio tentatively inquires if the Duke himself will grace the event with his presence. Internally, Antonio feels the pressure of Klaus's intense gaze, emphasizing the unique importance of Closet's debutante ball. Klaus coldly directs Antonio's attention to the mountains of paperwork, pointedly asking if he understands his workload. Klaus dismisses the event as a mere birthday party he can't reschedule for, assuming Closet understands, which Antonio sees as further proof of his detachment. Antonio interjects that it's more than just a birthday, as Klaus muses on his dedication to his duties. With earnest concern, Antonio stresses the significance of it being her debutante ball. Antonio explains the political weight of a debutante ball, where noble families scrutinize attendance and alliances. He suggests Closet must be feeling hurt by Klaus's indifference, despite her silence, but Klaus dismissively questions a new servant's insight. Klaus coldly asserts his relationship with Closet has always been one of fulfilling mutual obligations. Antonio questions the term obligations, prompting Klaus to clarify it means providing her with the best of everything. Klaus believes providing material wealth is the extent of his duty, leading Antonio to despair at his utter lack of understanding. Antonio firmly states that material provisions are insufficient, his disappointment palpable. He challenges Klaus, asking if he truly believed Closet wouldn't be affected by his absence, especially since they only had each other after their parents' deaths. As Antonio tries to convey Closet's youthful suffering, Klaus impatiently silences him, calling him too noisy. Klaus, his patience clearly exhausted, coldly orders Antonio to leave his presence immediately. Defeated yet composed, Antonio acknowledges the Duke's stance, apologizes for the intrusion, and departs. Alone, Antonio reflects on Closet's deep reliance on her brother, acknowledging that to her, the Duke is everything. Klaus, alone with the mask, internally scoffs at Antonio's arrogance, yet the servant's words seem to linger. An aide approaches Klaus, announcing an urgent report he must deliver first. The aide informs Klaus of the reinvestigation into Baron Hessink's family, conducted as per his orders. The aide hands Klaus a document, suggesting its contents warrant the Duke's personal attention. Reading the report, Klaus discovers Roselia Hessink's death certificate was forged, confirming his earlier suspicions. Klaus, his gaze sharp and contemplative, wonders what secrets Antonio is concealing. At the masquerade, guests congratulate Lady Closet, who, beside her masked partner Antonio, graciously thanks them. A guest marvels at the party's splendor, remarking it is befitting the esteemed Balthazar ducal house. Her companion concurs, as they observe the hosts from afar, the lavishness of the event undeniable. Lady Juside Belmont, with her companion, approaches to compliment Lady Closet on the impressive celebration. Closet thanks Lady Juside, then inquires about her companion, whom Juside introduces as her older brother, offering birthday wishes. The young Marquis, mistaking Antonio for the Duke, eagerly extends his hand, much to Antonio's surprise. The Marquis gushes about his anticipation to meet the Duke, admitting he attended solely for that purpose. He remarks on the Duke being smaller than his intimidating reputation suggested, laughing, while Antonio stammers in embarrassment. Closet quickly clarifies that Antonio is not her brother, leaving the young Marquis utterly confused. Closet introduces Antonio as her partner, linking arms with him as he manages a nervous smile. The flustered Marquis confesses his assumption, and then tactlessly asks about the actual Duke's arrival. Lady Juside chides her brother for his inappropriate question, as Closet and Antonio exchange uncomfortable glances. Closet, looking downcast, explains the Duke is too busy to attend, a disappointment shared by Antonio. The Marquis apologizes for his blunder, while Antonio seethes internally at what he perceives as deliberate troublemaking. Whispers spread among guests about the Duke's absence, fueling rumors of a rift between the siblings and distressing Closet. Antonio watches with concern as guests murmur about the Balthazar family's precarious future due to the Duke's non-appearance. A sudden announcement electrifies the room. Duke Klaus de Balthazar has arrived. Antonio and Closet are dumbfounded, staring in utter disbelief at the unexpected arrival of His Grace. Klaus, masked, apologizes for his tardiness, explaining he hurried for Closet's 15th birthday. Klaus extends his formal congratulations to Closet on her special day. Delighted, Closet exclaims his timing is perfect, informing Klaus, whom she calls brother, that the Belmont children were eager to meet him. Closet eagerly prompts the Belmont siblings to introduce themselves to her younger sibling, leading to the Marquis's flustered greeting of the true Duke. Antonio, astonished, wonders if his earlier confrontation with Klaus actually prompted this unexpected appearance. Before Antonio can ponder further, the enthusiastic young Marquis approaches Klaus, eager to ask a question. Antonio observes the scene with a sense of resignation, feeling his intervention ultimately made no difference. Closet subtly but proudly indicates Klaus, silently presenting him as her brother to the onlookers. Lady Juside, irked by Closet's smug display, internally fumes at the obnoxious girl. Still annoyed, Lady Juside plots her revenge against Closet, her gaze ominously falling upon Antonio. Antonio finds himself approached by Lady Juside, who proposes a toast, and he raises his glass in response. Lady Juside sips her drink with a determined glint, silently vowing to make Closet wait and suffer. Lady Juside inwardly resolves to seize what Closet treasures most, as both she and Antonio drink. As a servant offers refreshments, Lady Juside claims loneliness, prompting Antonio's confused inquiry about her brother. Lady Juside suggests a private conversation, alarming Antonio, who internally questions her motives. Klaus observes Closet's rare happiness, considering it a positive development. Reasoning it's best to neutralize potential threats to Closet, Antonio reluctantly agrees to Lady Juside's request for a private chat, much to her delight. In a secluded area, Lady Juside, now seated, pointedly asks Antonio if he has something to say. Lady Juside invites Antonio to sit, her smile unwavering and hinting at a hidden agenda. Antonio hesitates, but Lady Juside reminds him he is a guest, not a servant, and should relax. Despite his unease, Antonio considers her words, a bead of sweat betraying his nervousness. Antonio cautiously sits, stating he cannot stay long, attempting to maintain some semblance of control. He reminds Lady Juside of his role as Closet's partner, a fact she acknowledges with nonchalance. Lady Juside, with a sly smile, assures Antonio that a brief moment is all she requires for her plan. Closet, noticing Antonio's absence, asks Klaus where he went, concerned as he was present just moments before. Klaus informs a shocked Closet that Antonio left with Lady Juside. He then questions Closet's surprise. Klaus casually asks Closet if Antonio and Lady Juside aren't allowed a private conversation, deflating her slightly. Lady Juside refills Antonio's glass, cryptically asking if he is aware of something. She confesses her strong feelings for Antonio, asking if he recalls a particular past interaction. Lady Juside brings up the day Antonio styled her hair, a flashback revealing her flustered reaction to his touch. With a faint blush, she admits her feelings for Antonio began that day. Antonio, feigning comprehension, internally panics, unsure how to respond to this uncomfortable confession. Lady Juside leans closer, directly asking for Antonio's opinion of her, putting him in an awkward position. A flustered Antonio attempts to leave, but accidentally spills wine on himself, as Lady Juside feigns surprise. Lady Juside offers to clean Antonio's stained shirt, an offer he hastily refuses, insisting he is fine. Antonio reiterates his urgent need to depart, clearly desperate to escape the escalating situation. Suddenly, Antonio feels weak and dizzy, wondering why his body is betraying him. Lady Juside, with a sinister smile, inquires if Antonio is feeling unusually warm. She continues, feigning concern as Antonio collapses, asking if he has a fever, while he cries out her name in alarm. Paralyzed and horrified, Antonio realizes Lady Juside must have drugged his wine. Lady Juside confesses her long-held hatred for Closet, deeming her arrogant. She disparages Closet, calling her a bitch reliant on her background, and asks for Antonio's agreement as she reaches for his mask. Lady Juside questions Closet's entitlement to good things and anticipates Closet's reaction to losing her possession, as Antonio weakly struggles. Menacingly, Lady Juside leans in, wondering if Closet will still desire Antonio after he has been defiled by her. Antonio internally rages against this damned woman, his secret female identity and paralyzed body trapping him in despair. He despairs at the thought of his most guarded secret being revealed to Juside in such a degrading manner. Closet storms in, demanding Juside leave, her voice filled with fury as a shocked Antonio weakly calls out. Closet, seeing Antonio's state, cries out his name in alarm and concern. She anxiously asks Antonio if he is regaining consciousness. He groggily responds with her name. Relieved, Closet confirms Antonio seems all right, while he clutches his aching head, asking what transpired. Antonio urgently inquires about Lady Juside. Closet dismissively assures him she dealt with Juside harshly. Antonio expresses disbelief at Juside's actions, then notices the grave expressions of Closet and Melda, questioning their demeanor. Suddenly aware of his changed clothes, Antonio asks for his own, and Closet calmly directs him to them. Closet explains they changed him because his clothes were wet, revealing a neatly folded set, including chest bindings, shocking Antonio. Horrified and blushing, Antonio stammers, asking if they saw everything, his secret now completely exposed. Closet, with a stoic expression, comments that what they saw was quite impressive, much to Antonio's mortification. Panicked and flustered, Antonio exclaims his shock at being discovered in such a way. He questions Closet and Melda's calm reactions, wondering if they already knew he was a woman, but Closet denies prior knowledge. Antonio notes Closet's lack of surprise, to which she defensively insists she was indeed surprised. Closet then asks, "But so what?" leaving Antonio utterly bewildered by her nonchalance. She firmly states that Antonio is Antonio, regardless of gender, as that doesn't change who he is as a person. Closet shyly admits she had secretly hoped Antonio was a woman, adding it worked out well, much to Antonio's touched relief. A wave of profound gratitude washes over Antonio for Closet's understanding and acceptance. Visibly emotional, Antonio begins to apologize for his deception and attempts to explain his reasons. Closet reassures Antonio, guessing his actions were due to her brother, and promises secrecy, a sentiment Melda echoes. Antonio expresses his thanks to both, as Closet and Melda playfully admit they always thought he was too pretty for man. Overjoyed, Closet reveals she had a dress prepared just in case, her foresight hinting at her earlier suspicions. Closet happily exclaims she didn't expect to dress Antonio so soon, while a bewildered Antonio questions her preparedness. Klaus, searching for Closet, wonders why Antonio hasn't returned, while the persistent young Marquis tries to engage him. The Marquis laments that even days wouldn't suffice for his questions, as Klaus silently notes his lack of restraint. The young Marquis eagerly asks Klaus about a rumored feat of fighting 20 palace knights single-handedly. Klaus spots Antonio, now in a dark blue gown, across the hall with Closet, his attention captured. Antonio, disguised as Antonia in a dress and wig, anxiously looks for Lady Closet. Antonia expresses her discomfort with the charade to Closet, who dismisses her worries. Closet frets about discovery and warns Antonia that Lady Juside will be a predatory threat. Antonia attempts to reassure Closet that Lady Juside has subdued the Duke, then trails off nervously about potential consequences. Closet declares she won't protect Antonia this time, causing Antonia to cry out in alarm. Antonia pleads with Closet not to abandon her at the party, lamenting the unfairness of the situation. Feigning betrayal, Antonia dramatically exclaims she believed they were friends. Closet, moved by Antonia's distress, apologizes and promises to stop meddling, to Antonia's slight relief. Closet attempts to feign sadness, but notes her lack of tears, inwardly frustrated by her inability to cry on demand. The arrival of Crown Prince Esteban Vandeloop Lugbelzit, the son of Lugbelzit, is announced. The announcement continues, heralding Her Highness Crown Princess Ivliani Lugbelzit. Klaus inquires about Closet's whereabouts, and then asks after Antonio. Closet vaguely claims Antonio felt unwell and retired early, arousing Klaus's skepticism. Crown Princess Ivliani, seeing her brother, reacts with nervous alarm. The royal siblings extend birthday wishes to Closet. Klaus and Closet offer gratitude for their formal highnesses' greetings, attending to the crown, despite their prince and crown princess. Closet expresses her gratitude for their highnesses attending, despite their demanding schedules. The crown princess graciously responds that attending Closet's birthday was a matter of course, delighting Closet. The crown prince thanks Klaus for their previous encounter and inquires after his well-being, surprising Klaus. Antonia, seizing the opportunity, plots her escape, silently apologizing to Closet for her abrupt departure. Antonia inadvertently collides with the crown prince, who remarks on the coincidence of their meeting. The crown prince, looking pointedly at Antonia, comments on encountering everyone here. Antonia offers a formal greeting to the crown prince, who tells her to dispense with formalities given their prior acquaintance. A flustered Antonia feigns ignorance about their past meeting, which the crown prince casually dismisses. The crown prince unexpectedly pulls a surprised Antonia into a dance, instructing her to cooperate quietly. Crown Princess Ivliani watches in shock as her brother defies her to dance with Antonia, telling her to simply dance. Antonia silently fumes at the crown prince's high-handedness as they begin to dance. The crown prince observes that Antonia possesses a rather mischievous streak, making her uneasy. He astutely asks if Antonia is using him to provoke the crown princess, surprising her with his perception. Guests whisper about the crown prince's choice of first dance partner, leaving Crown Princess Ivliani visibly humiliated. Klaus observes the scene, noting the crown princess's evident embarrassment. The crown prince further compliments Antonia on her quick wit, confusing her. He takes her hand, remarking on the thinness of her wrist, a subtle hint at his knowledge. The crown prince stuns Antonia by revealing he knows Duke Balthazar is unaware of her true gender. He offers to maintain her secret if Antonia assists him once more, leaving her to wonder what he requires. The crown prince leans provocatively close, causing Antonia to panic that onlookers will misinterpret their proximity. With a knowing smile, the crown prince states he will not forget this debt. Antonia internally dreads the future repercussions of this encounter, as the crown prince looks past her with an "oh my." Klaus approaches with a menacing aura, declaring he has something to say to the crown prince, startling them both. The crown prince cautions Klaus against frightening the lady with his aggressive approach. He then taunts Klaus, asking if the duke came to dance with him instead. Klaus, his expression stern, curtly orders the crown prince to step aside. The crown prince criticizes Klaus's disrespectful tone towards a lady, implying Klaus's business is with him. Antonia, seizing her chance amidst the confrontation, flees in a panic, silently screaming for rescue. Hidden and breathless, Antonia realizes she fled instinctively, without a second thought. As Antonia panics about her next move, a hand firmly grasps her from behind. Klaus commends her impressive escape skills. As a startled Antonia turns to face him, Klaus directly addresses her as Roselia de Hessink, shattering her disguise. He asks how many times she has now fled from him. Roselia desperately feigns mistaken identity. Klaus reveals her death certificate is forged, blaming official incompetence, but stating one truth is now undeniable. He declares that Antonio deceived him, a realization that makes Roselia inwardly curse her predicament. Klaus demands to know if she has maintained contact with Antonio. Roselia begs him to spare Antonio, claiming he acted solely out of concern. Unmoved, Klaus concludes they have both deceived him and proposes they repay their debts at his estate. Roselia is horrified at the prospect of fulfilling both roles, deeming Klaus utterly unreasonable. Klaus asserts it is unfair for Antonio alone to bear her family's debt, his words giving Roselia pause. Roselia apologizes for her deceit, but refuses Klaus's demand, resolving to face the consequences directly. She offers to take Antonio's place at the next settlement, proving her commitment to repaying the debt. Klaus observes Roselia, struck by the similarities in their manner and aura, questioning their supposed lack of kinship. Closet, witnessing the exchange, suddenly realizes the striking resemblance between Klaus and Antonio, exclaiming "brother." In shock, she rushes to Roselia's side, anxiously asking if Aunt Roselia is all right. As Klaus looks on, Klaus dryly remarks he had wondered how Roselia managed to infiltrate his banquet. He concludes Closet is also complicit in the deception, surprising her. Closet defiantly argues that settling the debt is all that matters, regardless of the means, seeking Roselia's validation as Klaus realizes her involvement. The oblivious young Marquis appears, still eagerly searching for the Duke, hearts practically in his eyes. Klaus curtly informs Roselia he will see her at the next settlement, then takes his leave. Closet and Roselia watch Klaus depart as the confused young Marquis wanders by, still on his quest. Roselia apologizes to Closet for the unexpected turn of events, wishing she had heeded her advice. But Closet, relieved her own secret is safe, downplays the incident. Closet calls her brother a fool for his cluelessness in this matter, despite his usual astuteness, and Roselia hesitantly concurs. Closet urges Roselia to return quickly, expressing her growing concern, and Roselia agrees. As they walk, Closet inquires about Roselia's apparent closeness with the crown prince. Roselia deflects, warning her of Klaus's stealth. Roselia reflects on her rash promise to replace Antonio at the next settlement. Back in her Antonio disguise, Roselia regrets her promise and focuses on finding the next painting. A woman holding a document offers assistance to Antonio. Antonio accepts the document with thanks. She notices distinct paint stains on the woman's fingertips. Peeking over the document, Antonio feels certain this woman is the artist she seeks. The woman is identified as Nadia Erlos, the artist behind the Crown Princess's second collection. Antonio orders a beer, and Nadia inquires if she would like a meal as well. Antonio initially agrees, then hastily tries to prevent Nadia from retrieving the document. She asks Nadia's name, feigning a desire to leave a tip for her supposed kindness. But Nadia is skeptical. Nadia scoffs at being called kind, just as someone calls her name from across the room. Antonio smiles triumphantly, having confirmed Nadia's identity and her successful search. As Antonio begins to address Nadia, the artist abruptly flees. The man who called Nadia shouts after her, demanding to know where she is going. Antonio is left completely baffled by Nadia's sudden and inexplicable flight. The scene shifts to the magnificent exterior of the Duchy of Balthazar. Antonio, dejected, sighs over her fruitless efforts and wasted trouble. She wonders again about Nadia's abrupt departure, questioning what she might have done wrong. Muttering about recent troubles, Antonio is startled by Klaus's sudden appearance and address. Klaus dryly comments that her startled reaction is appropriate, given her guilt. Antonio nervously denies any wrongdoing or knowledge of a message from Klaus, who insists she has something to confess. Klaus pointedly mentions her supposedly deceased sister, Roselia, being very much alive at the banquet, rendering Antonio speechless and sweating. With a stern gaze, Klaus demands to know how Antonio dared to deceive him so shamelessly. Antonio internally panics, perceiving Klaus's demeanor as utterly terrifying and threatening. In a moment of comical despair, Antonio laments her situation and considers an emotional appeal. She attempts to justify her past actions, claiming ignorance of Klaus's true character at the time. Antonio now showers Klaus with compliments on his mercy and kindness, offering to accept punishment while hinting at her own reasons. But Klaus remains unmoved. Klaus calls Antonio's name, causing her to jump in apprehension. He begins a sentence, so, then trails off, leaving Antonio anxiously wondering about his unspoken thoughts. Klaus sighs, then unexpectedly tells Antonio to do as she pleases, internally resigning himself to her actions. To Antonio's utter astonishment, Klaus then sincerely thanks her for everything, leaving her completely speechless. Closet's words send a jolt of disbelief through Antonio, while Duke Balthazar coolly confirms the undeniable truth of her statement. The Duke inwardly reflects on his sister, Closet, unexpectedly calling him older brother, a term that resonates deeply within him. A memory surfaces, a masked ball from years past, a mysterious young woman with white hair by his side, an echo of a different time. He searches his mind, but finds he cannot pinpoint the last instance she had addressed him with such familial affection. The Duke expresses his gratitude to Antonio for diligently assisting Closet with her debutante preparations, and for sharing insights into her true desires. Antonio, touched by the Duke's acknowledgement, offers his own heartfelt thanks, a warmth spreading through him. Duke Balthazar, referred to as Your Excellence, watches with keen surprise as Roselia takes Nadia's hand, her actions always managing to be unforeseen. He braces himself, anticipating the kind of trouble Roselia often attracts, just as a man with an eye patch lunges towards him with clear aggression. The Duke effortlessly neutralizes the charging assailant, his impressive fighting skill momentarily captivating Roselia. Roselia urgently pulls Nadia away from the scene, and Nadia, though hesitant, agrees to follow. Concealed from view, Nadia curiously asks Roselia about her abrupt decision to hide, pointing out that she seemed to recognize the Duke. Roselia nervously admits a connection, confessing that fleeing from him has become an ingrained, almost reflexive habit. Nadia suddenly begins to cough, prompting a concerned Roselia to anxiously inquire about her well-being. Roselia, with a complicated gaze, concedes to Duke Balthazar that her physical being seems to have an undeniable response to his presence. Internally, she attributes this unwanted attraction to the original Roselia's connection to Klaus, insisting it's merely a residual effect of the story she's trapped in. The Duke is visibly taken aback by her frankness, but Roselia firmly clarifies that despite any physical reaction, their relationship remains strictly one of debtor and creditor. Challenging him, Roselia pointedly asks if he would save her from an accusation of treason, a fate the original Roselia couldn't escape after being used. Roselia silently acknowledges the disquieting truth. Her very body seems inexplicably drawn to the Duke, a pull she struggles to comprehend. The Duke questions her sudden talk of treason, bewildered. Roselia coolly assesses him as someone who prioritizes his own benefit, ruthlessly discarding anything or anyone unprofitable. Looking him directly in the eye, Roselia presses further, asking if her assessment of his pragmatic and potentially cruel nature isn't precisely accurate, a grim past scene flashing in her mind. The Duke appears flustered, protesting that it's unfair of her to judge him based on such an improbable, hypothetical scenario. Roselia's expression hardens. His failure to even feign a promise of rescue is a clear enough answer for her. The Duke softly utters her name, Rosel, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. She firmly tells him not to try and sway her with empty words he doesn't mean, turning her back on him and walking away with resolve. Roselia feels a sense of triumph, believing that with this confrontation, she has decisively altered the tragic fate prescribed for her in the original story. A quiet determination settles within her as she walks towards the grand gates. She will not die, and that, ultimately, is all that truly matters. Suddenly, a gentle breeze rustles around her, and Roselia stops, an unexpected wave of confusion washing over her. Tears well in her eyes, much to her own surprise and chagrin. She finds the sudden emotional outburst utterly ridiculous. She internally berates her uncooperative body for its betrayal as she quickens her pace, fleeing from the ducal estate and her conflicting emotions. Marquis Eucliade arrives before a grand estate, confidently assuming it to be the Balthazar Duchy. A guard confirms the location, but expresses doubt that Marquis Eucliade can see Duke Balthazar without an appointment. A concerned Eucliade waves away. Marquis Eucliade clarifies his purpose. He hasn't come to see the Duke, but rather a servant named Antonio. It is revealed that Roselia's location had become impossible to ascertain, and her foster brother, Antonio, is believed to be the only one who knows how to contact her. Roselia remembers hearing a rumor that Antonio was employed as a servant within the ducal estate. A sound startles Roselia, making her wonder if someone is calling out her name. Suddenly, Duke Balthazar's hand closes around Roselia's arm, and she turns in surprise, recognizing him instantly. Roselia struggles, demanding the Duke release her and questioning his abrupt and forceful actions. The Duke confronts her for attempting to leave without hearing him out, but Roselia retorts that she has already said all she needs to. Roselia gazes at the Duke, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes as she tries to understand what is happening between them. Marquis Eucliade approaches the pair, and Roselia, surprised by his presence, asks why he is there. Marquis Eucliade interjects, pointing out to Duke Balthazar that Roselia is clearly distressed by their interaction. The Duke remains silent, observing. With a gentle tone, Marquis Eucliade asks Roselia if she is all right, to which she quietly affirms. Marquis Eucliade suggests they relocate to a more private place to talk, away from the Duke's imposing presence. As Roselia moves closer, Marquis Eucliade is suddenly struck by a distinct, familiar scent emanating from her, causing him to pause. A look of dawning realization crosses his face. There is no doubt in his mind, now she is family. The narrative explains the unique trait of the Lafellio's bloodline, an inherent scent, akin to pheromones, imperceptible to those of the same sex. This scent, however, is strongly perceived by the opposite sex, its intensity heightening with strong emotions like joy, sorrow, or love. Roselia softly calls out to the Marquis. Marquis Eucliade addresses her as Cecilia, a name filled with longing, then quickly corrects himself, proposing they find somewhere else to converse if she agrees. A profound realization dawns on him. After so many long, arduous years, he has finally found her. His heart aches as he imagines the suffering she must have endured, alone in a foreign land, and an overwhelming urge to reveal everything to her surges within him. He yearns to tell Cecilia the truth that has burdened him for so long, that she is his lost sister, and he, her brother. Roselia, whom he knows as Cecilia, acknowledges his assistance yet again, her gaze questioning the unusually deep and intense look in his eyes. Marquis Euclid decides this isn't the opportune moment for a revelation, fearing it would overwhelm Cecilia. Instead, he carefully inquires if she is facing serious difficulties with the Duke. Roselia attempts to laugh off his concern, dismissing her troubles with the Duke as a mere work-related disagreement, but Euclid sees through her facade, sensing her distress stems from her debt. Marquis Euclid makes his excuses, stating he has urgent business elsewhere and must depart. Roselia, somewhat relieved, readily agrees. Roselia observes a flicker of what seems like disappointment in his eyes as he turns to leave, wondering if she's merely imagining it. Marquis Euclid turns back, his voice earnest as he asks Roselia, still seeing Cecilia, if they will have the chance to meet again. Roselia is visibly startled and flustered by his direct question. Euclid, noticing her reaction, quickly tries to reassure her, urging her not to misunderstand his intentions. He clarifies hastily that his interest isn't romantic. She simply reminds him of a little sister he once knew. He offers her his unwavering support, assuring her she can come to him if she ever needs help, without feeling any pressure. Roselia, still a little dazed by the encounter, hesitantly agrees to his offer. As the carriage departs, Roselia walks away, a sense of strangeness lingering from the encounter with the Marquis. She reflects that a character like him, a second lead, should typically be a source of annoyance. Yet, for some reason, Marquis Euclid isn't. She continues on her way, idly wondering if her unexpectedly positive impression of him is simply because he is handsome. Antonio, now identified as Roselia, resumes his duties, presenting a warship model to Count Wavel, whom he affectionately calls Grandpa. Roselia, as Antonio, tries to jog Count Wavel's memory, asking if the ship model sparks any recollection, perhaps an urge to draw, as she continues her efforts. The Count jests about an itch, attributing it to a mosquito, while Roselia silently acknowledges the difficulty of her task. Roselia hopes that if the Count rediscovers his passion for painting, she can finally repay her debt and leave this place. Her attention is then caught by something new. The Count has completed a painting, a portrait. Roselia asks if the solemn man depicted in the portrait is the Count's son. The Count confirms, adding that his son now commands the Empire's foremost naval fleet. The Count sighs, expressing a hint of bitterness that his rascal son, no matter how engrossed in state affairs, shows so little concern for his own father's well-being. Roselia realizes the Count also had a military background, and, seeking to stimulate more memories, curiously asks about his experiences during his service. The Count begins to reminisce. HMPH, back in my prime, transporting him back to a vivid memory of himself on the deck of a ship amidst a raging storm. Nadia, having recovered somewhat from her coughing fit, confirms Roselia's name. Nadia expresses her sincere gratitude to Roselia for her help, acknowledging that despite this being their first true meeting, she feels indebted. Roselia, surprised by Nadia's earnestness, feels a pull of kinship and impulsively invites Nadia to accompany her, believing their encounter to be fated. Nadia humbly presents her dwelling to Roselia, a place clearly marked by poverty and neglect. Roselia insists on expressing her gratitude for Nadia's earlier kindness, even as Nadia demurs, feeling she has done nothing to deserve thanks. With a gentle but firm tone, Roselia insists Nadia sit, stating she has her pride and wishes to properly thank her. Roselia takes in the truly dire conditions of Nadia's home, a wave of dismay washing over her as she realizes the depth of Nadia's suffering. Count Wavel proudly recounts commanding vast fleets across the Callao Sea. Roselia, as Antonio, feigns excitement, inwardly pleased that his memories are stirring. The Count boasts of his fleet's invincibility, their victories in battle, and the honors bestowed by the royal family. Roselia, playing her part, expresses awe. The Count's demeanor shifts, his voice heavy with sorrow as he recalls the brutal reality of war, the hell on earth where he lost countless comrades, his breath catching on the name Vagnon. Roselia begins to offer an apology. The Count becomes visibly distressed, lost in a traumatic flashback, shouting for Vagnon and reliving the chaos of a desperate battle, ordering a retreat to save the living. Roselia watches, her concern growing. Roselia, as Antonio, gently offers the agitated Count a cup of warm tea. She observes quietly as the Count sips the tea, relieved that after the intense episode, he has finally begun to calm down. Roselia reflects on how profoundly shocked and disturbed the Count had been by the resurfacing memories. The narrative recounts how the Count had momentarily relapsed into his battlefield persona, with Roselia, as Antonio, struggling to bring him back to the present. Roselia understands with a pang of empathy that the agonizing pain of those wartime memories continues to haunt him deeply. She feels a twinge of guilt for potentially pushing him too far, even with the intention of helping him recover for her own monetary reasons. The sudden ringing of the doorbell interrupts her thoughts, and she asks if he was expecting anyone. The Count has no idea who it could be. Roselia, as Antonio, offers to go and see who is at the door. The doorbell chimes repeatedly and aggressively, signaling an impatient visitor. Roselia hurries to answer, calling out that she's coming. Roselia reaches the door, wondering who could be ringing with such insistence, and opens it, her expression shifting to one of surprise. Lady Closet stands at the doorway, offering a bright and cheerful greeting to a startled Roselia, still in her guise as Antonio. Roselia, as Antonio, asks how Lady Closet managed to find her there. Closet explains with a smile that she did a little investigating since Antonio had been avoiding her lately. Closet, ever polite, requests to greet the Count first before addressing any other matters. From within, Count Vavel gruffly calls out that he isn't buying whatever is being sold. Closet quickly clarifies that she isn't there to sell anything. Roselia, as Antonio, formally introduces her as Lady Balthazar. The Count, unimpressed, reiterates his disinterest in purchasing anything, regardless of her title, leaving Closet momentarily speechless and Roselia, as Antonio, suppressing a smile. Closet leans in to whisper to Roselia, expressing her doubt that the rather senile-looking old man could be the renowned artist she seeks. Roselia confirms his identity, but explains his current condition has prevented her from seeing any of his recent work. Roselia, as Antonio, subtly reminds Closet that if she wishes to quickly escape her brother's overbearing influence, securing the Count's artistic assistance is crucial. Closet, with a sudden burst of enthusiasm, cheerfully announces her intention to help, much to Roselia's surprise. Closet presents a drawing to the Count, eagerly asking for his opinion, startling the old man from his reverie. The Count scoffs disdainfully, claiming even a drawing done with his feet would surpass hers. Offended, Closet challenges him to prove it by trying to draw himself. The Count dismisses her challenge with a "why should I?" Closet, undeterred, tells him to stay quiet and let her work. Roselia, as Antonio, observes with amusement, holding a tray of snacks and musing on Closet's unique definition of helping. Roselia, still holding the tray of snacks, curiously asks Closet why she has prepared a new, blank canvas. Closet, now equipped with a palette and brush, beams with newfound enthusiasm, declaring her intention to continue drawing as she finds it surprisingly enjoyable. Roselia, as Antonio, watches Closet ponder her next subject, a fond smile playing on her lips as she thinks Closet is cute, before announcing it's time for snacks. Closet stands before her easel, thoughtfully considering the blank canvas, while Count Vavel observes her from a short distance behind. The Count approaches Closet's easel, his expression critical as he examines her attempt at painting, and pointedly asks her what is wrong with it. Closet, with a playful pout, declares she simply doesn't know what's amiss with her rendition of the vase filled with blue flowers. The Count decisively takes the paintbrush from a surprised Closet, who reluctantly yields it to him. He begins his critique, noting she applied too much paint, causing the vase to dominate the composition at the expense of the flowers. Roselia, as Antonio, watches intently. The Count explains that the primary focus should be on the flowers themselves, his gaze fixed on the actual vase, serving as their model. Roselia and Closet watch in awe as the Count, with a few deft strokes of the brush, transforms the painting. Roselia, as Antonio, exclaims with admiration that this must be the great artist she heard about, as they both marvel at the significantly improved artwork. Closet, beaming, proudly asks if she wasn't right about his talent. Closet showers the Count with praise for his excellent drawing skills, happily noting how much her own attempt improved thanks to his guidance. The Count seems taken aback by the compliment. The Count, perhaps feeling a resurgence of his old self, abruptly declares he's hungry and commands Antonio to prepare some food. Closet immediately objects, reminding him that Antonio is her servant, not his. Roselia, as Antonio, looks thoughtfully at the Count, a question forming on her lips as she begins to speak. The Count, looking directly at Antonio, suddenly asks with genuine confusion why he is wearing men's clothes, a question that stuns both Roselia and Closet into silence. Roselia, utterly flustered, stammers, asking the Count to repeat what he said after his demand for food, hoping she misheard. The Count appears genuinely bewildered, unable to recall his own surprising question, leaving Roselia and Closet in a state of stunned, awkward silence. The sun sets over the Grand Balthazar Duchy, casting long shadows. Closet confides in Roselia, as Antonio, that the Count's recent behavior gave her quite a scare, her heart still racing. Roselia admits to feeling nervous as well. Roselia, as Antonio, breathes a sigh of relief, thinking for a moment that their secret cross-dressing charade was surely exposed. Duke Balthazar materializes behind them, his voice cutting through their relieved whispers as he asks pointedly what they meant by almost caught, startling them both. Roselia, as Antonio, complains about the Duke's habit of sneaking up on them, then nervously asks what he meant by his question about being caught doing something. Closet dismisses the Duke's inquiry as unimportant and urges Antonio to leave with her. The Duke's voice, firm and commanding, calls out to Antonio. Duke Balthazar directly asks Roselia, as Antonio, if the other Roselia, the blonde lady, said anything noteworthy to him. Roselia, maintaining her composure as Antonio, denies that the blonde Roselia mentioned anything of particular significance. The Duke considers Antonio's response for a moment, then, with a curt nod, allows him to leave. The scene transitions to the opulent meeting hall of the Raffaello's delegation within the imperial palace. An attendant remarks to Marquis Eucliode that his earlier behavior was rather impolite. Marquis Eucliode, unconcerned by the observation. But the Marquis entrance. Marquis Eucliode, unconcerned by the observation, formally thanks him for arranging their meeting and directly asks the purpose of his summons. Duke Balthazar, who has a reputation for treating people as mere instruments for his own gain, remarks that he was unaware Marquis Eucliode and Roselia were so close. The Duke then casually mentions hearing a rumor that Marquis Eucliode and Roselia were once lovers, a statement that causes the Marquis to splutter in shock and frantically ask if Cecilia, Roselia, was the source of this claim. Marquis Eucliode, regaining some composure, clears his throat repeatedly, a dawning suspicion in his eyes as he realizes the Duke might be probing. He carefully states that he and Cecilia were indeed happily reunited after a very long time. Duke Balthazar observes him keenly, sensing there's more to the story. Duke Balthazar muses internally that this Cecilia has undeniably captured Marquis Eucliode's full and rather intense attention. Back in Closet's room at the Balthazar estate, Antonio, Roselia, expresses genuine admiration for the painting Closet has produced, asking if she truly created it herself. Closet winks confidently, explaining she sketched it by referencing Grandpa's, Count Wavel's invaluable advice. Antonio, Roselia, has a moment of realization. She'd been in the presence of an undiscovered talent all along. Antonio, Roselia, ponders why the original novel failed to depict this obviously talented and creative side of Closet's personality. Duke Balthazar enters the room carrying a cloth-draped object, his unexpected appearance, and the mysterious item startling both Antonio, Roselia, and Closet. The Duke explains that he was thinking of Closet and purchased the covered item as a gift for her. Antonio, Roselia, notes internally that it's quite unusual for the Duke to deliver a gift personally rather than sending a servant. Closet curiously lifts the cloth. Nadia humbly offers Roselia a painting, explaining it's not much, but it's all she has to give as a token of gratitude. Roselia is visibly taken aback, her eyes widening in stunned recognition as she beholds the artwork. Her breath catches as she identifies the piece, the legendary second collection of the Crown Princess, a masterpiece she thought lost. The painting itself is described as a mesmerizing spectacle, a dazzling beam of pure light shimmering with all the hues of a rainbow, captivating and almost hypnotic to behold. Nadia, a soft cough escaping her lips, reveals with a melancholic smile that this is the very last painting she ever created. Roselia is profoundly shocked by Nadia's revelation, a chilling thought striking her. Does Nadia already know the tragic fate that awaits her? The narrative introduces Nadia Erlos, a painter blessed with extraordinary, almost divine talent. However, destiny had a cruel twist for her, She was fated to succumb to illness before the world could ever truly recognize her genius. Roselia sadly reflects that this abstract, luminous piece indeed became her final, poignant work. The Duke unveils his gift to Closet, a charming yellow canary nestled within an ornate birdcage. Closet immediately finds the little bird adorable. Closet appears slightly flustered by the Duke's gesture and thoughtful gift. The Duke clears his throat, a hint of awkwardness in his demeanor. The Duke manages a somewhat stiff, thanks, likely in response to Closet's appreciation of the canary. Closet gazes thoughtfully at the Duke, a surprising observation forming in her mind. She had never imagined him capable of a genuine smile. She then turns her attention to the canary, wondering aloud what name she should give it. The Duke abruptly calls out for Antonio, his sharp tone startling Roselia, still in disguise from her thoughts. He then extends an unexpected invitation to Antonio to have tea with him sometime, an offer that leaves Roselia utterly surprised and slightly wary. Later, Duke Balthazar and Antonio, Roselia, are seated by a warm fireplace, a tea set between them, an air of formality tinged with curiosity. Roselia, as Antonio, sips her tea, inwardly puzzled by this sudden invitation. The Duke's previous interactions had always been brief and awkward. This was a significant departure. She wonders if there's been some internal shift in the Duke, a fleeting, anxious thought about poisoned tea quickly dismissed. The Duke then comments on Antonio's impressive progress in repaying his debt. Roselia internally pleads with the Duke not to smile at her so kindly, fearing she might develop an inappropriate attachment at this rate. The Duke looks at Antonio, slightly puzzled by his flustered expression. The Duke makes a surprising proposal. Even after Antonio has fully repaid the debt, he is welcome to continue residing at the ducal estate. Roselia is shocked into silence. He acknowledges Antonio's discerning eye for art and offers his continued financial support, recognizing that raising Roselia, Closet's sister, will necessitate a stable income. Roselia, as Antonio, firmly declines the Duke's offer, stating her intention to leave the estate as soon as the debt is settled. The Duke, surprised, asks where he plans to go. Antonio admits to not having given it much thought. His sole focus has been on escaping the ducal estate as quickly as possible. The Duke then inquires if Antonio intends to leave for Raffelios in the company of Roselia, the blonde one. The sudden mention of Raffelios catches Antonio completely off guard. The Duke elaborates, suggesting it would make sense, given that Roselia's beloved is none other than Marquis Eucliade of Raffelios. The word beloved sends a jolt of alarm through Roselia. The Duke asks if his assumption is incorrect. Roselia, flustered and desperate to maintain the ruse, hastily confirms that yes, the Marquis is indeed Roselia's beloved. Mortified at her slip-up and the implications of her confirmation, Roselia loses her composure and accidentally spills her tea. As she frantically dabs at the spill, Roselia apologizes profusely, inwardly bewildered as to why Duke Balthazar Klaus would assume she is Roselia's lover. She tries to rationalize the situation. Klaus seems friendly enough, so she can clarify things later. Yet, the weight of fabricating such a significant lie involving a foreign marquis troubles her. The Duke remarks thoughtfully that Antonio and Roselia, the blonde, always seem to carry a similar, distinct scent. He then casually asks if they use the same perfume. Roselia, flustered by the observation, stammers that it's probably just because they use the same brand of soap. The Duke advises Antonio to take some time to consider his offer, remarking that it's not a bad one, before rising to leave. Roselia, as Antonio, formally announces that he will also be taking his leave now. Alone, Roselia, Antonio sighs, wondering what has gotten into the Duke to make him act so uncharacteristically considerate and strange. A blush creeps up Roselia's neck as she reflects on the Duke's sudden change in demeanor. She quickly reminds herself not to get carried away. He is still Duke Balthazar, a man she must remain wary of. With a newfound resolve, Roselia decides she must stop the cross-dressing charade from this point forward and exits the room. Despite her firm resolution, the crown princess is later informed, much to her surprise, that Antonio Roselia somehow managed to fall into the lake. Closet expresses disbelief, questioning who would foolishly jump into a lake merely to save a hat. The crown princess calmly corrects her, stating that he didn't jump, he fell. The crown princess expresses relief that Antonio wasn't injured and mentions hearing that the Duke was the one who rescued him. She then quietly wonders about her own reasons for being there. The crown princess remarks that the duke, despite appearances, can be unexpectedly kind, then asks Closet if she remembers a childhood incident involving the duke and a rabbit. Closet looks puzzled by the question. The crown princess recounts an event from 8 years prior. Klaus had brought back a live rabbit, intending to skin it to make a fur muff for a young Closet. However, the plan went awry when young Closet, presented with the live rabbit, and learning its intended fate, burst into tears. Closet shudders at the memory, recalling her shock at Klaus's casual intention to skin the adorable bunny. Roselia finds this anecdote about the Duke's past behavior quite unexpected. The Crown Princess graciously thanks Roselia for the invitation to the tea party, acknowledging that Roselia must be very busy. Roselia warmly replies that one always finds time for people they like. The Crown Princess casually mentions a rumor about the Raffelios bloodline, that some members naturally emit a distinct scent from their bodies, causing Roselia to suddenly cough. Closet asks Roselia with concern if she is all right. Roselia, flustered but trying to appear nonchalant, assures her she's fine, though internally she's amused that Closet's questions sounded like she was referring to the second male lead in a novel. The Crown Princess admits her knowledge is limited to old records, explaining that while such a bloodline did exist, it has become diluted over time, making true descendants nearly impossible to find now. Even if a descendant inherited the trait strongly, it would be difficult to notice. Closet, her curiosity piqued, asks why it would be so difficult to notice such a unique trait. The Crown Princess explains that, according to the records, the Raffelios family traditionally teaches their heirs how to consciously control and suppress this unique scent. Once they master this control, they become virtually indistinguishable from ordinary people in terms of their scent. Marquis Eucliade approaches their table, and Roselia internally wonders, with a flicker of recognition, if this could be Cecilia. Closet remarks on how fascinating the idea of someone naturally emitting a scent is. Roselia confesses she initially dismissed it as nonsense when the Crown Prince mentioned it, but now realizes it's a genuine phenomenon. Marquis Eucliade, having overheard part of their conversation, politely inquires if the scent is the only notable characteristic of this bloodline. The Crown Princess admits she isn't entirely sure. Marquis Eucliade, with a charming smile, asks if he might also be permitted to have a cup of tea, his sudden appearance and request surprising both Closet and Roselia. Roselia, the Crown Princess, graciously states that she doesn't mind his joining them but defers to the others, unsure of their feelings on the matter. Marquis Eucliade acknowledges with a slight bow that perhaps he was a bit too eager in his approach. He begins to politely excuse himself from their company. Closet, surprisingly, intervenes, stating that she is quite fine with him joining, especially since he is the renowned Marquis of Raffelios. The Crown Princess formally invites the Marquis to take a seat. As he does, Roselia detects a faint, subtle scent emanating from him. The Crown Princess smiles gracefully, thinking to herself that offering a simple cup of tea is hardly a difficult courtesy to extend. Roselia silently wonders if the Marquis is wearing perfume, or if the subtle fragrance is indeed the scent of the bloodline that Evelyne, the Crown Princess, had just mentioned. The Marquis thanks them for their hospitality, and then turns to Roselia, politely inquiring if she has been keeping well. Roselia responds affirmatively and returns the courtesy, asking after the Marquis's well-being. The Marquis replies that he has been well enough, adding that it is nice to see her again. Later, back at the Balthazar ducal residence, Roselia appears troubled and contemplative. Closet whispers to Roselia, curious about when and how she became acquainted with the Marquis. Roselia vaguely replies that they met somehow at a palace party a while ago. Roselia decides to address the topic of her partner and turns to speak to the Marquis. The Marquis gently interrupts Roselia, his hand moving towards her hair as he asks her to pardon him for a moment, an action that surprises her. He notes the strength of her scent, realizing it signifies her blossoming period is near, and it dawns on him that she clearly doesn't know how to control this powerful emanation. Roselia looks at him, puzzled. He carefully removes a stray flower petal from her hair, his mind preoccupied with the thought that Cecilia must learn to control her potent scent before her blossoming fully occurs, or she could be in danger. Nadia coughs weakly, admitting she no longer even has the funds for paint. Roselia, concerned, asks if she has seen a doctor. Nadia dismisses the idea of a doctor, questioning where she would find the money while constantly evading debt collectors, and resignedly states she never expected a long life anyway. Roselia gently suggests to Nadia the possibility of selling her paintings as a way to earn money. Nadia remains silent, considering. Nadia quietly states that she has never created her art with the intention of selling it. She explains that for people like them, trapped by illness and poverty, painting was her sole refuge, a temporary escape from the grim certainty of their shared fate. While painting, Nadia could forget the misery of her existence. It was the only thing that offered her a sense of freedom from her cruel and unforgiving reality. Nadia confesses that she has sold all her other possessions out of necessity, but she could never bring herself to sell her paintings, as they represent her very freedom. Nadia, feeling a bit embarrassed by her outburst, offers the painting to Roselia as a gift, wondering aloud why she's revealing so much to someone she just met. Roselia looks at the painting, now understanding its profound significance to Nadia. It is her hope, her soul. The Marquis reaffirms his solemn vow. When Cecilia's blossoming time arrives, and she is inevitably in danger, he must be by her side, no matter what. Marquis Eucliade formally greets Closet, Roselia, and Duke Balthazar upon his arrival. Closet addresses him with a familiar brother. Duke Balthazar comments with a cool edge on Marquis Eucliade's audacity in inviting a guest to his estate without prior notification. Roselia internally groans, thinking she really hadn't wanted to encounter the Duke again so soon, especially not while she was in her true identity as Roselia. Duke Balthazar acknowledges the Marquis's presence with a curt "Marquis, we meet again." Marquis Eucliade offers a polite apology to Duke Balthazar for his unannounced arrival. The Duke, with a facade of hospitality, invites him to stay and rest for a while. Duke Balthazar expresses a desire to speak with Roselia, but Marquis Eucliade quickly interjects, stating that Roselia actually has something she needs to discuss with him. Marquis Eucliade then boldly declares himself Roselia's lover, requesting the Duke's understanding and offering apologies for the inconvenience, a statement that leaves both Roselia and Closet utterly flabbergasted. Roselia is stunned, wondering how on earth the Marquis even knew about the fabricated lover story, while Closet beside her is visibly aghast at the audacious claim. Continuing his protective stance, Marquis Eucliade requests that the Duke refrain from treating Roselia with disrespect in the future. The Duke dryly acknowledges the Marquis's apparent devotion. The Duke coldly reminds the Marquis that this is Lugvelset, not Raffaello's, and provoking a Duke of this nation, especially within his own domain, would be an exceedingly unwise choice. Marquis Eucliade firmly retorts that Roselia's comfort and well-being are his utmost priority, regardless of whether she is in a foreign land or his own. Roselia, exasperated by the escalating tension, wonders why the Marquis is overreacting to such an extent. The Marquis declares his protective stance would remain unchanged even if the Emperor himself stood against him for Roselia. Roselia, unable to bear the confrontation any longer, steps between the two men and firmly shouts for them both to stop. Attempting to diffuse the charged atmosphere, Roselia quickly suggests, with forced brightness, that someone seems to be calling for the Marquis. She pushes him gently towards the exit, assuring him she is fine and he should go ahead. The Marquis looks back at her, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Duke Balthazar concedes, his tone laced with warning as he tells the Marquis not to forget their prior conversation. Closet watches the exchange, utterly bewildered. As he is about to leave, Marquis Eucliade leans in and whispers to Roselia, sincerely reiterating his earlier offer of help, assuring her that he meant every word. Marquis Eucliade then takes his formal leave from the tense gathering. Once the Marquis has departed, Roselia turns to Duke Balthazar, recalling his earlier statement, and asks what it was he wished to discuss with her. The Duke confirms there was indeed something. Duke Balthazar, with an air of nonchalance that belies the recent tension, invites Roselia to join him for a meal, since she is already there. Roselia stares at him, incredulous that he orchestrated such a dramatic interruption merely to extend a dinner invitation, but hesitantly agrees. The Duke mentions that the evening's menu features a top-quality aged steak, and Roselia, annoyed by his pitying gaze, tells him to stop looking at her like that. Roselia sighs, already sensing she will regret this decision, but ultimately agrees to eat with him, thinking to herself that it's just a meal after all. A faint blush dusts the Duke's cheeks as he considers the upcoming meal, a hopeful, almost boyish thought crossing his mind. What could possibly happen? At the dinner table, Roselia finds herself struggling to breathe, the silence and lack of incident creating an unexpectedly suffocating atmosphere. Roselia exclaims in frustration that she can't even enjoy a meal in peace due to the unnerving tension. Closet, equally uncomfortable, directly asks the Duke what has possessed him to act so uncharacteristically today. The Duke calmly states he merely wished to share a meal with Closet and Roselia, adding it's a pity Antonio isn't present. Roselia idly wonders what Antonio might be doing, jokingly suggesting he's probably busy paying off debts somewhere, a comment that earns an annoyed glance from Closet. The Duke observes Roselia picking at her food and solicitously asks if she dislikes the meal. He offers to have the kitchen prepare something else for her. Closet, terrified by the Duke's bizarrely attentive behavior, whispers to Roselia, wondering if he's been possessed by an evil spirit. Roselia quickly reassures the Duke that the food is delicious, and there's no need for anything else. The Duke expresses his relief at her words. Closet internally laments that if her brother is possessed, the evil spirit certainly chose a poor host. The Duke, seemingly oblivious to Closet's internal monologue, states that he is perfectly fine. Closet silently observes her brother, still unable to comprehend his recent strange behavior, a behavior she finds increasingly unsettling and difficult to get used to. Roselia gazes at Nadia's painting, reflecting on its deep meaning for the artist. It was something she never wanted to sell, something she never wanted to lose her only hope. Roselia thanks Nadia for the exquisite painting, but sternly warns her never to set foot in this dangerous part of town again, if she wishes to avoid witnessing further horrors. With a gentle smile, Roselia promises Nadia that she will return soon. Nadia sighs, a touch of exasperation in her voice as Roselia departs, having seemingly ignored her warning. Roselia silently hopes that if Nadia receives proper medical treatment, she might yet survive. At the Crown Princess's palace, a servant announces the arrival of a messenger from the Balthazar Duchy. Antonio, Roselia in disguise, offers a respectful greeting to Her Highness. The Crown Princess acknowledges his presence, remarking that it has been some time. The Crown Princess expresses her disappointment that Antonio was not present at Closet's recent birthday banquet, mentioning she heard he had departed early. She then adds that she did, however, see his younger sister, Roselia, at the event, a comment that causes Antonio to become visibly flustered as he stammers about the banquet. That masked encounter was a memorable one indeed. Antonio was visibly distressed upon learning Evliany overheard talk of the Crown Prince's interest in Roselia. He internally seethed, convinced Roselia was merely a pawn. Evliany, taken aback by his emotional outburst, addressed him with a startled, "Your Highness." Evliany then revealed her reasoning for her actions. She calmly asked Antonio to set up a meeting with Roselia, much to his bewildered surprise and questioning. Evliany reassured Antonio that her intentions were not to interrogate Roselia. She then made a significant declaration. She is to become the future Empress of Lugbelzit. Evliany explained her duty to support Emperor Esteban and safeguard the nation, but she lamented the Crown Prince's unsettled heart and continued emotional distance, a pattern established since the banquet. Antonio silently acknowledged Evliany's astute grasp of the situation, a trait fitting for her role. Evliany elaborated that with adversarial forces lurking, the current instability posed a grave threat to the imperial family, a threat she was determined to neutralize. Then came Evliany's stunning proposal. She desires Roselia to become the Crown Prince's concubine, leaving Antonio utterly aghast. Evliany clarified that while Roselia wouldn't be empress, she would gain significant wealth and honor. Antonio, however, vehemently rejected the idea on Roselia's behalf, citing her lack of formal education and her commoner status, despite her title. Evliany calmly countered that education could easily be provided within the palace, reminding him that past emperors had indeed taken commoner concubines. Antonio was left speechless, grappling internally with whether this plan, even if for the nation's sake, was taking things too far. Antonio reflected on Evliany's admirable qualities, her strong sense of duty and unwavering commitment to the greater good, yet a seed of doubt, a hesitant but lingered in his mind. Resigned, Antonio conceded that he didn't perceive it as an entirely unfavorable proposal. However, Antonio had a lingering question he needed to ask Evliany. Evliany, maintaining her composure, prompted Antonio to voice his question. Antonio sought to understand if this decision stemmed solely from the crown princess's judgment, or if it was a sentiment genuinely shared by others. Antonio internally mused that while he found Evelyne admirable at times, there were other moments when he simply felt a sense of pity for her. Evelyne dismissed his question as peculiar, asserting her identity as the crown princess was absolute and indivisible. The notion of a self separate from her royal role was inconceivable to her. Evelyne reiterated that she couldn't imagine herself as anyone but Evelyne, the crown princess, for in her mind, her core identity remained unchanged by her title. Antonio began to articulate his own perspective to Her Highness. He revealed that he is known as a servant of the Duke's family, a statement that visibly surprised Evelyne. Continuing, Antonio added that some even refer to him as a fallen noble. He mused that names like Antonio and Roselia were merely superficial labels. Antonio asserted his belief that regardless of the names bestowed upon him, they were just external shells, not reflective of his true self, a conviction he constantly reaffirmed internally. Holding a painting, Antonio declared with quiet confidence that he would never forget his true identity. After a moment of bright contemplation, Antonio, with an apology, stated he must press his question to Evelyne once more. As Roselia navigated a marketplace, Evelyne internally questioned if Antonio possessed any sense of gratitude. Duke Balthazar informed Antonio that his deception would be forgiven this one time, but issued a stern warning against repeating such actions. Roselia stood alone, reflecting that she hadn't anticipated something at all. Nadia was desperately trying to explain to an approaching figure that unavoidable circumstances had prevented her return the previous day. Roselia recognized Nadia, who pleaded for understanding, emphasizing her urgent need to work. Evelyne paused, thoughtfully considering her own emotions. Evelyne confessed that she often experiences feelings of disappointment, particularly concerning Esteban. She admitted to a profound loneliness while enduring life in the imperial palace, revealing that painting had become her sole comfort. Evelyne explained she had never demanded much from Esteban, only that he acknowledge her as an equal partner and companion in shaping the empire together. That was her simple desire. Gently touching the canvas, Evelyne wondered if the artist who created this piece had shared similar feelings of isolation. Evelyne gazed at the painting, perceiving it as dazzlingly beautiful yet imbued with a palpable sense of solitude. A poignant thought emerged, comparing Evelyne and Nadia, two individuals seemingly disparate yet fundamentally alike, women who had surrendered everything, ultimately losing themselves in the process. Antonio expressed his gladness that Her Highness appreciated the painting. The painting itself depicted a vast, radiant, and beautiful sky, a symbol of freedom perhaps yearned for by Nadia, Evelyne, and even Antonio himself. Antonio then revealed the title of the artwork, Freedom. Evelyne offered a simple, heartfelt thank you. Nadia, hearing a knock, inquired who was there, as Roselia announced her presence from outside the door. Nadia, clearly annoyed, grumbled about having told Roselia not to come, just as she opened the door. Nadia was utterly astounded to see Roselia, who cheerfully reminded her of her promise to return, now accompanied by several men carrying supplies. Roselia announced their first task was to fix the window and directed the men to begin, while she and a surprised Nadia observed. A doctor began examining Nadia, inquiring about the duration of her symptoms. The doctor, peering at Nadia through a magnifying glass, demanded an explanation for the current situation, with Roselia standing silently beside them. Roselia proudly declared that she had come under the express orders of Her Highness, the Crown Princess. Nadia was visibly shocked at the mention of the Crown Princess. Roselia then explained that Her Highness had been profoundly moved by Nadia's artistic talent. Roselia conveyed the momentous news to a speechless Nadia. The Crown Princess had decided to become her patron, enabling her to continue her creative pursuits. With a smile, Roselia presented Nadia with a thoughtful gift, a complete set of art supplies. Roselia reminded Nadia of her earlier sentiment, that painting was the last thing she wished to protect, and assured her that now, she would never have to fear losing it again. Nadia softly called out to Roselia, who responded expectantly. Nadia quietly asked if Roselia would visit her frequently, confessing that she sometimes felt a little lonely. Roselia, with a bright and reassuring smile, promised Nadia that she would, of course, visit often. Roselia then added a gentle condition. Nadia must diligently take her medicine, to which Nadia readily agreed. Roselia reflected with satisfaction that just as the original narrative had been altered, Nadia's destiny too could be reshaped. The scene transitioned, marking the afternoon at the imposing Balthazar ducal estate. Roselia, having arrived at the ducal estate, affirmed to herself that she had indeed finally reached her destination. She recalled her earlier declaration to the Duke. If he feared she might abscond, she would personally deliver the next payment instead of relying on Antonio. Roselia, clutching a document, inwardly questioned the wisdom of having made such a bold promise. A knock interrupted the Duke's thoughts, and Antonio announced a visitor was at the door. Antonio informed the Duke that Roselia had arrived, causing the Duke to react with a slight, almost imperceptible startle. The Duke granted Roselia entry, and she offered him a formal greeting. The Duke, with a hint of mockery, questioned if she was wearing the same outfit, asking if it was her only one or simply her way of broadcasting her identity. Roselia, internally fuming at his insufferable demeanor, thought about her need to save every penny for her debts. The Duke, recalling that day, pointedly accused Roselia of having fled once more. Roselia, visibly flustered, managed to thank him for his assistance on that previous occasion. Attempting to explain her abrupt departure, Roselia stated that her companion had been unwell. The Duke pressed Roselia about her recent peculiar activities, appearing at a party unannounced, only to be seen fleeing from thugs shortly thereafter. He urged Roselia to abandon her stubbornness and questioned why she simply didn't return to the sanctuary of the estate. Roselia silently affirmed that regardless of how many times he posed the question, her resolve would not waver. Roselia reiterated her preference for her current lifestyle, claiming to be more comfortable, a notion the Duke met with open skepticism. The Duke questioned the extent of suffering Roselia was prepared to endure, implying dire consequences had he not intervened. Roselia, however, countered that she failed to understand his Grace's excessive concern. Roselia firmly declared her ability to manage her own affairs. The Duke dryly remarked that her temperament bore a striking resemblance to her siblings, a comment Roselia met with silence. Internally, the Duke cursed Roselia's obstinacy, then suddenly became aware of a familiar, subtle presence. The Duke once again detected that distinct, sweet, and intoxicating fragrance emanating from Roselia. He mused whether a perfume with such a unique scent even existed, as Roselia formally presented her payment. Roselia handed over the installment for her debt, as per their agreement, and once again expressed her gratitude for his previous assistance. Placing the envelope on the desk, Roselia asserted that His Grace possessed no authority to dictate the course of her life. Roselia made it unequivocally clear that her debt was monetary, not a claim on her person, as the Duke once more registered her captivating scent. The Duke, feeling a touch of lightheadedness, questioned if Roselia intended to maintain her proud defiance until the very end, wryly noting that an onlooker might misconstrue his intentions as being interested in her physically. He goaded Roselia, asking if her rejections were a tactic to inflate her perceived value and inquiring about the price of her compliance. Roselia responded with a subtle, almost defiant smirk, choosing to remain silent. The Duke, his cheeks slightly flushed, announced that henceforth all messages would be relayed through Antonio. Roselia stated her preference to avoid such unpleasant confrontations in the future, and they parted ways, an unspoken tension lingering in the air. The Duke castigated himself as a fool, acknowledging that Roselia's words had jolted him back to his senses and left him wondering what absurdities he had been uttering. He found himself perplexed by his inability to maintain rationality whenever dealings involved Roselia or her sibling. The bakery owner angrily confronted Nadia, dismissing her excuses and demanding to know why she had disappeared without a word. He reminded Nadia that he had taken her in out of pity, but sternly cautioned that the world was far harsher than she perceived. The owner then harshly declared there was no longer a place for her there and forcefully ejected her, despite Nadia's pleas to wait. Nadia sighed in defeat after being cast out, then noticed Roselia standing nearby, her expression questioning. Nadia accused Roselia of staring and suspiciously asked if she had been eavesdropping. Roselia, looking flustered, denied the accusation. Nadia abruptly turned and walked away, prompting Roselia to call out, urging her to wait. Nadia, irritated, asked Roselia what she wanted and why she was being followed. Roselia quickly explained that she hadn't intended to eavesdrop. Nadia curtly dismissed Roselia, telling her it was of no consequence and to mind her own affairs. A silent, frustrated thought, why damn it, Closet with cheerful energy called out to Antonio, inviting him to play. Closet, noticing Antonio's somber mood, inquired if something was amiss. Antonio hesitated before responding. With a flourish, Closet presented a box of cookies she had received as a gift, eager to share their prettiness. Antonio quietly concurred that the cookies were indeed pretty, as Closet enthusiastically urged him to try one. Antonio internally seethed, questioning why he should indulge Closet's whims, his irritation mounting with each passing moment. In a moment of frustration, Antonio crushed a cookie, prompting Closet to ask why he was taking his anger out on the innocent treats. Antonio offered a quick apology. Closet declared his current state unacceptable and suggested an outing. Antonio, unenthusiastic, asked about their destination. Closet enthusiastically proposed a picnic by the picturesque lake. Antonio stated he wasn't in the mood, but Closet insisted that was precisely why he needed an outing, believing fresh air would improve his spirits, and began to gently pull him along. Alejandro respectfully inquired if his grace was troubled by anything. The Duke responded with a noncommittal hem. The Duke downplayed Alejandro's concern, assuring him it was nothing of significance. However, the Duke conceded that a certain woman was indeed proving to be rather vexing. Alejandro, visibly surprised, exclaimed, "Finally!" prompting the Duke to question his outburst. Alejandro, his excitement palpable, eagerly asked if the Duke had at last developed an interest in someone, and readily offered to arrange a meeting. The Duke flatly denied it, much to Alejandro's confusion, who pressed further, wondering why else this woman would occupy his thoughts so intensely, unless she had absconded with his funds. The Duke, rubbing his temples wearily, admitted that she had, in fact, run off with his money. Alejandro acknowledged that this explanation seemed plausible. Alejandro suggested the Duke needed to rest and offered to manage his workload, proposing he take a refreshing walk. The Duke, finding himself outdoors despite his initial reluctance, dismissed the notion of romantic interest, attributing his preoccupation instead to that scent. He pondered the peculiar way the scent seemed to linger on an individual, his thoughts interrupted by the sight of something on the distant lake. The Duke recognized Closet and Antonio enjoying a boat ride on the lake. Closet, savoring a drink, remarked on the pleasantness of being outdoors. Antonio quietly conceded that it was nice, prompting Closet to ask again if he was truly certain nothing was troubling him. Antonio insisted he was perfectly fine, dismissing his worries as unworthy of discussion with Closet. Closet, thoroughly irritated, muttered insults at Antonio, calling him a jerk and a cold-hearted oaf, then accidentally fumbled and dropped her hat. Antonio promptly offered to retrieve the hat, which was now floating on the water's surface. Closet nonchalantly dismissed his offer, stating she would simply buy another one, a remark that caused Antonio to inwardly scoff at her casual display of wealth. Antonio internally seethed at Closet's dreadful personality, as she yelled at him to stop his attempt to retrieve the hat. As Antonio leaned precariously over the side of the boat, reaching for the hat, Closet shouted a warning about the danger. Antonio lost his footing and tumbled into the water with a loud splash, while Closet shrieked his name in alarm. Sinking beneath the surface, Antonio realized with dawning horror that he was unable to swim. As he descended further into the water, the chilling thought crossed Antonio's mind. So this is how I die. Antonio despairingly questioned if all his struggles were to culminate in such an ignominious end. Overwhelmed by a desperate will to live, Antonio silently pleaded for someone, anyone, to come to his aid. Suddenly, a hand reached down through the water towards the drowning Antonio. The Duke roughly hauled Antonio from the lake, urging him to regain his composure as Antonio coughed up water. The Duke, furious, berated Antonio, questioning his sanity and demanding to know how he could have recklessly jumped into the lake. Antonio, tears streaming down his face, thought he had finally understood the true meaning of death. The Duke, still incensed, questioned Antonio's inability to remain still, calling him insane. Antonio, however, believed his predicament stemmed from carrying the burdensome fate of death. Still shaken, Antonio slowly realized that his perceived understanding of death had been merely an illusion. Antonio admitted to the Duke that he had genuinely believed he was going to die, as the stark realization dawned that this was no longer a fictional narrative, but his harsh reality. Trembling uncontrollably, Antonio repeated his terrifying conviction that he had truly been on the verge of death. Tears still flowing, Antonio wondered if the Duke truly needed to scold someone who had just narrowly escaped drowning, as the horrifying weight of his new reality crashed down upon him. Closet rushed towards Antonio, calling his name anxiously, while the Duke observed the scene. Closet, deeply concerned, checked if Antonio was all right and able to breathe. Antonio, blushing slightly, managed to reassure her that he was fine. Closet, her voice trembling with fury, lambasted Antonio for terrifying her over a mere hat, and sternly warned him never to repeat such a reckless act. Antonio meekly apologized, while the Duke stood nearby, a silent observer of the exchange. Antonio, his face still flushed, found himself wondering about this unfamiliar sensation and questioning the Duke's intense gaze. Antonio managed to express his gratitude to the Duke for saving his life. The Duke, his tone icy, curtly advised Antonio to exercise greater caution in the future. Closet fumed internally at the Duke's callous indifference after Antonio's near drowning, mentally labeling him a heartless, unfeeling man, before turning her attention back to Antonio to check on his well-being. Alejandro expressed his surprise at seeing the Duke completely drenched, inquiring why he resembled a drowned rat. Antonio, alone and still deeply shaken, replayed the terrifying moments of his near-death experience in his mind. The Duke found himself contemplating an unfamiliar and unsettling emotion. Roselia trailed after Nadia, a sense of concern etched on her face, reflecting that, unlike their previous encounter, her decision to dress as a woman seemed to be the correct one, as Nadia wasn't attempting to flee. Roselia gently took Nadia's arm, explaining that she has a tendency to meddle when she sees injustice, causing Nadia to yelp in surprise and pain. Two menacing thugs confronted Nadia, one tauntingly asking if she believed they wouldn't locate her, derisively calling her Nadia Erlos, and comparing her to a scurrying rat. The thugs advanced, one stating they had matters to discuss, as Roselia, her voice trembling, nervously inquired about their identity. Roselia, her voice laced with panic, frantically asked Nadia if she had become indebted to loan sharks, urging her to speak, while Nadia silently cursed her predicament. The scene transitioned to the opulent surroundings of the Crown Princess's palace. Evliany inquired if the artist Nadia Erlos had declined payment for her painting. Antonio clarified that Nadia preferred to consider it sponsorship, and added that artist Abelo Hentham was also diligently working on his commissioned pieces. Evliany expressed her relief at this news, and commended Antonio for his diligent efforts. Antonio humbly responded that he had merely fulfilled his expected duties. Evliany acknowledged his response with a nod, then informed Antonio that she had something she wished to ask him. Antonio respectfully invited her to proceed. Evliany announced that a delegation from the formidable Rafaelio's empire was scheduled to arrive shortly. Antonio internally registered the significance of the impending Rafaelio's delegation. Antonio recognized that the prophesied moment had arrived, acknowledging the imminent entrance of the sub-male lead into the unfolding narrative. Evliany further explained that a grand welcome banquet would be held in their honor upon arrival, before broaching the subject of her request to Antonio. Evliany then asked Antonio if he would consider attending the upcoming banquet as a guest, accompanying Roselia, a suggestion that visibly shocked him. Antonio internally recoiled at the thought of attending a formal banquet with Roselia, bewildered by everyone's apparent eagerness to see them together. Antonio, forcing a nervous laugh, expressed his deep honor at the invitation, but voiced concerns that his presence as a mere servant might lead to unwelcome misunderstandings. Evliany acknowledged his concerns with understanding, much to Antonio's quiet relief. Evliany then suggested it would be perfectly acceptable for Roselia to attend the banquet alone, confessing a lingering guilt for her previous disrespectful treatment of her. Antonio quickly reassured Evliany not to worry, casually dismissing Roselia's awareness of any slight. Evliany wondered aloud if she was perhaps asking too much of him again, reflecting that her sole intention had been to treat both Antonio and Roselia with kindness. Evliany theatrically lamented her supposed lonely and pitiful existence. Antonio, his patience wearing thin, finally interrupted her performance. Antonio, with evident reluctance, agreed to speak with Roselia about attending the banquet, a concession that brought a visible wave of delight to Evliany's face. Antonio walked away, sighing heavily under his breath about the relentless succession of problems, now compounded by the prospect of a royal banquet. Crown Prince Esteban observed Antonio's approach, remarking that he had come to see the Crown Princess yet again. Antonio appeared slightly surprised by his presence. Antonio was visibly startled by the sudden and imposing appearance of Crown Prince Esteban. Antonio offered a formal salutation to His Highness. Esteban, however, commented on Antonio's coolness, especially considering the secrets they had supposedly shared. Antonio silently urged Esteban to display at least a modicum of warmth towards the crown princess. Antonio, with a dismissive air, announced his intention to depart. Esteban, however, casually inquired if Antonio was aware of a particular piece of information. Esteban revealed an intriguing detail. Within the Rafaelios bloodline, certain individuals possess the unique trait of emitting a natural, discernible fragrance. Antonio was visibly perplexed by this talk of bloodlines and inherent fragrances, questioning why Esteban was directing such inquiries towards him. Esteban mused that Antonio seemed genuinely unaware of his own nature, noting that the scent, previously faint, had recently become more pronounced. Antonio internally braced himself for what might come next. Esteban stated he had heard rumors that Antonio was not, in fact, related by blood to the Hessink barony, and proceeded to ask if Antonio possessed any knowledge regarding his true parentage. Antonio admitted he knew very little, explaining that his mother had passed away when he was young without revealing anything, while internally lamenting the limited backstory typical of a background character. Esteban suggested that the arriving delegation, which included members of that particular bloodline, might present a valuable opportunity for Antonio to discover the truth. Just then, an attendant urgently called for the crown prince. The attendant implored Esteban to hurry, informing him that the delegation had just passed through the castle gates. Esteban expressed surprise at their swift arrival. Esteban attempted to conclude his conversation with Antonio, but the attendant, with a sense of urgency, physically pulled him away, leaving Antonio standing alone. Esteban, clearly annoyed by the interruption, remarked on the attendant's haste, but reluctantly agreed to accompany him. Esteban silently reflected that he had been on the verge of offering Antonio some crucial advice. Antonio hurried away, his mind racing as he contemplated the implications of the advice. He had almost received the need to learn to control something on his own. Esteban's unspoken counsel concluded with a foreboding thought: "You're going to have a very hard time." Alejandro formally introduced himself, stating he had the honor of serving as the Duke's closest and most trusted secretary. Alejandro observed that while the Duke was typically consumed by his work, his recent behavior had been uncharacteristically strange. Alejandro discreetly noted the Duke letting out an uncharacteristic, sudden sigh. Alejandro further observed the Duke muttering to himself, "No, that can't be," a habit entirely foreign to his usual demeanor. The Duke exclaimed in frustration, "But then why does she keep? Damn it." Alejandro, startled by the outburst, surmised the Duke must be under immense stress and decided it was best not to interfere. The Duke summoned Alejandro, who promptly responded to his call. The Duke instructed Alejandro to send for Antonio. Alejandro, overhearing the command, felt a pang of sympathy for the unfortunate Antonio. Antonio announced his presence outside the Duke's chamber door and was bid to enter. Antonio stepped into the room, internally questioning the reason for the Duke's abrupt summons and warily wondering if he was about to be drawn into a confrontation. The Duke stated he had an inquiry regarding Antonio's sister, Roselia, specifically whether she was romantically involved with someone with whom she envisioned a future. Antonio was utterly bewildered by the Duke's unexpected and personal question. The Duke, his expression unreadable, coolly stated his reason for asking. He was interested. Antonio stammered, initially misinterpreting the Duke's inquiry as something grave before the word interested fully registered. Antonio was visibly shocked and flustered by the Duke's candid admission of interest in Roselia. The Duke questioned Antonio's exaggerated reaction, remarking that it was perfectly natural for men and women to develop romantic feelings for one another. Antonio nervously conceded the Duke's point, but remained visibly agitated and uncomfortable. The Duke pressed Antonio again, demanding to know whether Roselia had a lover or not. In a burst of panic, Antonio blurted out that such a thing was not allowed. The Duke archly questioned Antonio's assertion that it was not allowed. Antonio, meanwhile, was consumed by internal panic, acutely aware of how this particular storyline was supposed to conclude. A desperate thought consumed Antonio. He and Roselia must never, under any circumstances, be together. He began to stammer an explanation. Antonio firmly declared that Roselia did indeed have a lover, pointedly telling the Duke to abandon any pursuit. The Duke scoffed at the notion of this supposed lover, questioning his character for idly standing by, while Roselia endured debt, eviction, and pursuit by thugs. The Duke disdainfully questioned if such a person could even be legitimately called a lover. Antonio, flustered, insisted that the lover lived far away, but maintained that a lover was a lover nonetheless. The Duke, with chilling resolve, threatened to forcibly enter the castle grounds if guards were not present. Antonio, aghast, shouted that such an act constituted trespassing. Antonio vehemently insisted that Roselia, having a lover, had absolutely no intention of meeting or entertaining advances from anyone else. The Duke found Antonio's overly vehement reaction peculiar and asked him to clarify his meaning. The Duke mused aloud why Roselia would be so horrified at the prospect of involvement with someone like him, who possessed both impeccable background and substantial wealth. Antonio, thoroughly terrified by the Duke's demeanor, fleetingly considered abandoning the situation entirely, internally labeling the Duke as seriously unhinged. The Duke, sensing his hesitation, coldly prompted, "Or what?" Roselia whispered urgent instructions to Nadia, just as one of the thugs noticed that Nadia was not alone. The thug roughly grabbed Roselia, contemptuously questioning the identity of this stuttering newcomer. Nadia bravely stepped forward, attempting to shield Roselia by claiming she was merely a random stranger and demanding the thug release her. The thug, unconvinced, sneered at Nadia's assertion that she had only just met Roselia. The thug, brandishing a knife, declared that Nadia's attempt to protect Roselia actually made the situation even more favorable for them. The lead thug menacingly suggested that the fate of a random stranger was inconsequential, adding that it was better for Nadia not to be alone when sold off. Roselia, finding herself and Nadia surrounded by menacing thugs, desperately wondered if this perilous situation had been part of the original story's plot. Nadia, incensed, turned on Roselia, demanding to know why she had needlessly followed her. Roselia, equally stressed, retorted whether this was truly the appropriate time for such a discussion. The Duke pressed Antonio, asking if there was some other, unspoken reason for his strenuous objections. Antonio became even more flustered by the pointed question. Antonio's inadvertent use of informal speech did not escape the Duke's notice, clearly irking him. The Duke, with a dismissive wave, stated he understood Antonio's protectiveness of his sister and curtly told him to leave. Antonio was visibly surprised by this abrupt and seemingly lenient dismissal. The Duke, his patience clearly exhausted, coldly asked if Antonio had failed to hear his explicit instruction to depart. Antonio hastily agreed and beat a swift retreat, muttering under his breath about the Duke being a lunatic and a cold-blooded tyrant. The Duke, alone once more, pondered what kind of answer he had truly been expecting from Antonio and sternly admonished himself to regain his composure. The Duke resolutely reaffirmed to himself that his burgeoning attraction was directed towards Roselia, not Antonio, convinced that this was the inevitable and correct path. A majestic castle bathed in light appeared, accompanied by the thought, "You've had a long journey." The esteemed delegation from the Raffelios Empire received a formal welcome to Rugvelzit, with Johannes von Eucliade expressing gratitude for their warm hospitality. Johannes von Eucliade formally introduced himself as the Marquis of the Raffelios Empire. Johannes noticed Crown Prince Esteban intently observing him and respectfully inquired if His Highness wished to say something. Esteban, despite the impropriety of asking upon a first meeting, inquired if Marquis Eucliade happened to have a younger brother. The Marquis politely denied having one. Esteban offered his apologies for the unusual question, privately thinking that Evliany had sensed a resemblance as well. Esteban internally observed that Johannes bore a striking similarity to someone he knew. Johannes then clarified that while he had no younger brother, he did, however, have a younger sister, then seemed to correct himself, perhaps thinking of Antonio/Roselia. Evliany, intrigued, gently probed the meaning behind his use of the past tense, did, when referring to his sister. Johannes explained, with a touch of sadness, that his sister had gone missing over a decade ago, and her whereabouts remained unconfirmed. Evliany, visibly surprised by this revelation, quickly apologized for her insensitive question. Johannes graciously dismissed her apology, stating it had happened a long time ago. Evliany expressed her sincere hope that he would find his sister soon, to which he offered a quiet thank you. Esteban then offered to escort Marquis Johannes to his designated lodgings. As Johannes followed Esteban and Evliany, his thoughts drifted to his long-lost younger sister. Johannes reflected, with a hint of melancholy, that he had almost allowed the memory to fade. He vividly recalled his younger sister, Cecilia, and their mother, a cherished memory tinged with loss. Johannes remembered that Cecilia had been merely 3 years old the last time he had seen them, and he mused that, if she were still alive, she would be an adult by now. As he walked away, a lingering question haunted Johannes's thoughts. Are you even alive, Cecilia? The grand welcome banquet for the Raffaello's delegation commenced under the evening sky at the castle. Closet gasped in awe at the opulent banquet hall, remarking that it seemed as though every noble in the empire was in attendance, while Roselia looked on with apprehension. Roselia felt an overwhelming sense of displacement, acutely aware that she could no longer consider herself a noble. Closet, flustered, quickly corrected her near-slip of addressing Roselia as Antonio. Closet offered words of encouragement, reminding Roselia that she was an honored guest, personally invited by the crown prince, and urged her to hold her head high. Roselia managed a hesitant agreement. Closet, her spirits high, enthusiastically led Roselia into the dazzlingly lit banquet hall. Closet excitedly wondered, aloud, who they might encounter that evening, as they stepped onto the grand, red-carpeted entrance of the ballroom. A distinguished young nobleman approached Lady Closet, formally greeting her and requesting the honor of her first dance. Closet, with a delighted laugh, accepted his invitation. Roselia, observing the exchange, remarked on Closet's evident popularity. Roselia scanned the crowded ballroom, her eyes searching for the Raffaello's delegation, particularly eager to catch a glimpse of the second male lead's face. Roselia's attention was drawn to an impressively distinguished man, seen only from behind, who was surrounded by a coterie of admiring ladies. She wondered if this could be him. Roselia tried to recall the original story's description of the second male lead, her thoughts interrupted by Crown Prince Esteban's voice, addressing her as a professional escape artist. Esteban greeted Roselia with a deliberately insulting epithet, causing her to recoil in surprise and dismay. Esteban nonchalantly inquired if his rather pointed greeting had been a bit too harsh. He then asserted, with an air of amusement, that he had actually been attempting to assist Roselia in his own unique fashion. Roselia, flustered and embarrassed, stammered an apology if she had inadvertently offended His Highness while he appeared occupied, pleading for him to overlook the incident. The Crown Prince smirks, reacting with a cool "Oh, is that so?" to an unheard statement. He then offers Roselia a conditional pardon. If she dances with him again this time, he will gladly forgive her. Roselia inwardly seethes at the demand, thinking to herself what an ill-tempered crown prince he is. Duke Balthazar hands documents to his aide, Lognon, instructing him to take care of them, which Lognon confirms he will do. Lognon then inquires if His Grace, Duke Balthazar, will be attending the upcoming banquet. The Duke affirms he should, believing that leaving a good impression will smooth negotiations with the delegation. Lognon respectfully wishes the Duke a good time, as Duke Balthazar departs for the banquet. Duke Balthazar mentally resolves to focus solely on his work at the banquet, determined to forget both Antonio and Roselia. He scoffs at his own resolution to forget, yet feels a sliver of relief that his current distraction is Roselia, not Antonio. A sudden, unspoken but flickers across Duke Balthazar's determined face, hinting at unresolved thoughts or a shift in his intentions. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince tells Roselia he has something important to convey, prompting a flustered Roselia to ask if he can't just say it without the dance. He explains that there are too many prying ears nearby, then pointedly calls Roselia by her name. Just then, Duke Balthazar appears, boldly requesting to be Roselia's first dance partner for the evening, leaving both Roselia and the Crown Prince stunned. Roselia desperately tries to calm her racing heart, telling herself that whether this development aligns with the original story or not is irrelevant right now. Her mind flashes back to a perilous situation where survival was paramount, and she remembers searching for self-defense techniques on her phone, images of two menacing figures with knives vivid in her memory. The memory continues, showing a self-defense video playing on her phone, with animated figures demonstrating a powerful punch. The video's instruction echoes in her mind. The first step is to inhale deeply. Then, as shown in her memory, she had screamed with all her might. The video explaining the purpose was to confuse her opponent. In her recollection, her desperate cry for help startled her would-be attackers. At the banquet hall, Duke Balthazar pauses, asking Lognon if he also heard something, as if a distant shout had reached his ears. Whispers ripple through the crowd as guests murmur about His Highness, the Crown Prince, who watches the unfolding scene with a serious expression. More whispers follow as onlookers note that both Duke Balthazar and the Crown Prince are simultaneously asking the same woman to dance. The crowd buzzes with curiosity about Roselia's identity, while the Crown Prince challenges the Duke's audacity, and the Duke firmly insists Roselia herself should choose. Roselia feels an immense wave of pressure and panic, wanting neither man, as they exchange terse, confident remarks over her. The Crown Prince and Duke Balthazar formally present themselves, their hands extended, silently compelling Roselia to make her choice. Roselia hesitates, a knot of anxiety in her stomach, knowing she must select one of them despite her reluctance. She ultimately takes Duke Balthazar's hand, reasoning internally that a cold-hearted man is a safer choice than a married one, much to the Crown Prince's evident surprise. As they begin to dance, Roselia tells Duke Balthazar not to misunderstand. She didn't actually want to choose him. He dryly remarks that she must truly dislike him. Roselia then asks him to clarify his earlier statement, specifically his reason for asking her to dance in the first place. She shrewdly deduces his motive. He asked her to dance to protect the Crown Princess, preventing the Crown Prince from dancing with Roselia again and placing the princess in an awkward position. Duke Balthazar gazes at Roselia as she confidently asks if her assessment is incorrect. He concedes she isn't wrong, but adds another, more personal reason. He also didn't want the Crown Prince to have her, pulling her closer as he speaks. Roselia is visibly shocked and flustered by his admission, realizing with a jolt that his earlier expressions of interest might have been genuine. Still disoriented and stumbling slightly in their dance, Roselia confesses that she truly doesn't understand him. Duke Balthazar then informs her that she has successfully captured the Crown Prince's full attention, directing her gaze across the ballroom. Roselia gasps, her eyes widening in alarm as she sees the Crown Prince indeed staring intently in her direction. Duke Balthazar leans in, warning Roselia that the moment the current song ends, the Crown Prince will be ready to snatch her away, making her anxiously wonder what she should do. Suddenly, exclaiming the Duke's name in surprise, Roselia finds herself being led away by him as he firmly states, "This way." Confused, Roselia asks where they are going, and Duke Balthazar instructs her to stay put in a more secluded area until things calm down. Once they are somewhat hidden, Duke Balthazar turns to Roselia and directly asks how she knows the Crown Prince. Roselia claims they barely know each other, to which Duke Balthazar gravely warns that the Crown Prince's interest in her is not a good thing, a truth she should understand better than anyone. Roselia defensively retorts that it's not as if she desires his attention, exclaiming how frustrating the entire situation is for her. As Roselia insists she isn't orchestrating any of this intentionally, Duke Balthazar gently shushes her. Feeling his presence intensely, Roselia stammers, you're too." She nervously asks Duke Balthazar if he could please step back a little, clearly flustered by his close proximity, but he remains silent and unmoving. Duke Balthazar's gaze intensifies as he quietly asks Roselia, "Did you know?" He then leans even closer, his lips near her ear, and murmurs that she has a really nice scent, causing Roselia to gasp his name in alarm. Before she can react further, Duke Balthazar kisses her, then pulls back slightly to comment that her lips are hot. Roselia is utterly flustered and aghast, her mind reeling as she silently questions what she is doing with this man. Panic sets in and her thoughts race, wondering what she should do, what she possibly can do, as she instinctively starts to back away. She flees from the room, berating herself for being crazy and feeling as though she's caught under some inexplicable spell. Her escape is short-lived as the Crown Prince intercepts her, grabbing her arm and insisting he needs to talk to her. Roselia tries to deflect, suggesting next time. The Crown Prince, however, declares that her scent is currently filling the entire palace. Roselia looks at him, utterly bewildered by his talk of a scent. He explains he intended to give her a warning for old time's sake, but her constant running is giving him a headache, and cautions that someone is bound to notice her unusual aroma soon. Roselia, still confused about the scent and the nature of the warning, is told by the Crown Prince that there is one more thing. He advises her to try not to get too involved with Duke Balthazar, admitting, with some annoyance, that he actually finds her quite likable. The Crown Prince concludes by stating that he would rather not have to deal with Roselia himself. A narrative box appears, ominously describing Klaus, the Crown Prince, as the story's villain, destined to sow discord between the main couple and instigate rebellion, ultimately to be defeated. Roselia, with newfound resolve, decides she cannot get involved with Klaus and must remain clear-headed. She ignores his attempt to call her back and walks away, determined. Back in the main hall, Duke Balthazar curtly informs Lognon that he didn't hear anything and instructs him that the top tier is waiting, so they should proceed. Duke Balthazar pauses, lost in thought for a moment, prompting his aide, Lognon, to inquire if something is amiss, Your Excellence. The scene flashes back to Roselia's memory of being attacked. She lets out a terrified scream. Her assailants panic, one urging the other to quickly cover her mouth. One of the attackers grabs Roselia's arm, harshly ordering her to shut her mouth. The self-defense tutorial from her memory plays again. If an opponent charges at you, step forward with one foot. Suddenly, Roselia is startled from her reverie by her sister, Clausette, who appears and demands to know where Roselia has been. Clausette angrily accuses Roselia of abandoning her and interrogates her about her whereabouts and activities. A flustered Roselia denies going anywhere or doing anything, defensively retorting that Clausette was the one who abandoned her first. Clausette eyes her with deep suspicion. Roselia internally frets, wondering how Clausette would react if she discovered what had transpired with the Duke. She imagines Clausette furiously berating her. You, of all people, dare to covet the Duke. How dare you go after my brother? Roselia miserably thinks she deserves such insults. Trying to appear casual, Roselia asks Clausette if she smells like anything unusual. Clausette dismisses the question, saying not at all, and that skipping one day's bath is hardly a big deal. Roselia feigns relief, then quickly claims she's not feeling well and asks if she can go in first, silently calling Clausette a pest. Clausette observes Roselia's flushed face and remarks that she does look unwell, almost as if she has a fever. Roselia forces a nervous laugh. Concerned, Clausette offers to call a carriage for Roselia and begins to lead the way. A nearby servant informs Roselia that her carriage should arrive shortly. She thanks him politely. Roselia anxiously thinks she needs to escape before encountering Klaus, the crown prince, again, wondering how she could possibly face him now. She considers hiding for a while, but her thought is cut short as Duke Balthazar. Klaus to her materializes before her, causing her to jump in surprise. Roselia panics internally, her eyes wide, wondering if Klaus is looking for her. He stands silently, his expression unreadable. Just then, a servant announces that Marquis Euclide's carriage has arrived. Seeing an opportunity, Roselia quickly decides to approach him. Flustered, Roselia apologizes to Marquis Euclide for the suddenness of her request, asking if she might ride with him. He seems mildly surprised, but cautions her to be careful as she approaches. Marquis Euclide gives a faint, polite smile and permits Roselia to enter his carriage. Duke Balthazar observes Roselia and Marquis Euclide departing together, his expression thoughtful as he questions their unexpected association. Inside the carriage, Marquis Euclide glances sideways at Roselia, himself wondering about the circumstance of them being together. A sudden, incorrect thought strikes Marquis Euclide. Roselia must have a lover. This, he muses with some satisfaction, means Duke Balthazar is available for his sister. Duke Balthazar watches the carriage pull away, the phrase Roselia's lover echoing in his mind with a hint of disquiet. Roselia, peering out the carriage window as they depart, lets out a sigh of relief, feeling momentarily safe. She expresses her gratitude to Marquis Euclide for agreeing to her abrupt request without hesitation. He politely responds that it's nothing, and he doesn't mind. Marquis Euclide explains that he sensed she had her reasons for the urgent request, so he couldn't refuse. Roselia thanks him once more, and asks if he could please drop her off nearby. Marquis Euclide, however, insists on escorting her all the way to her destination, stating that it's far too dangerous for a lady to be wandering alone at night. Roselia internally realizes returning to the Duke's estate is out of the question, and decides her best option is to stay at Nadia's place for the night. Marquis Euclide turns to her with a slight smile, beginning to ask, "Don't you think?" He completes his thought, asking Roselia if she doesn't find it curious that they look quite alike. Roselia looks at him, surprised by the observation. As the carriage rumbles on, Roselia reflects that, now that he mentions it, this person indeed bears a striking resemblance to her. Marquis Euclide jests lightly that since he is the elder, it would be more accurate to say that she, the lady, resembles him. Roselia laughs nervously, agreeing that people do say everyone has a look alike. Seizing the moment, Marquis Eucliade suggests they formally introduce themselves, starting with his own name, Johannes von Eucliade. Roselia is visibly shocked, her mind racing as she realizes Johannes is the second male lead from the story. No wonder he's so handsome. Johannes explains his position as the representative of the Raffaello's delegation and his title of Marquis. Roselia then introduces herself as Roselia de Hessink, adding that she has heard a lot about him. Roselia indicates a nearby street, stating her destination is close and she can walk the remaining distance. Johannes inclines his head, replying, "It's an honor." As Roselia alights from the carriage, she thanks Johannes profusely for his help. He dismisses her thanks, telling her to think nothing of it. Johannes offers a charming smile and expresses that he looks forward to seeing Lady Roselia again. Roselia, caught off guard by his directness and charm, stammers an emphatic "why yes." In agreement, once Roselia is out of earshot, Johannes quietly instructs his aide, Lognon, to look into her. Lognon confirms he will. Johannes muses to himself that while Roselia's hair color is different, the resemblance to someone he knows is uncanny. Repeating her name, Roselia de Hessink, The scene transitions, showing the Grand Balthazar Duchy, illuminated by the night sky. Inside, Closet yawns widely, declaring she's exhausted and heading to bed, then casually asks Duke Balthazar about Antonio's whereabouts. Closet becomes visibly flustered and defensive when Duke Balthazar deflects her question by asking about Antonio, stammering that he's probably in his room. Duke Balthazar observes her reaction with a raised eyebrow, wondering why she's suddenly so agitated. Closet insists she told Antonio to rest because he wasn't feeling well and that he shouldn't be disturbed. Muttering to himself that Closet is such a handful, Duke Balthazar walks to Antonio's door and announces his presence. The scene flashes back again to Roselia's memory of the attempted abduction. The self-defense voiceover instructs to shift one's weight and bring hands in front of the chest. Her attacker curses her. The memory continues, just like this, and push them away. Roselia executes the move, forcefully shoving her assailant. Having successfully pushed the man off balance, Roselia urgently tells Nadia, "Now, run." Back in the present, Duke Balthazar calls out Antonio's name and states he's coming in. He pushes open the door and enters Antonio's room, remarking, "Just how sick are you?" Duke Balthazar stops short, finding the room empty, and wonders aloud where Antonio could have gone at this late hour. Meanwhile, at Nadia's humble dwelling, Nadia gently prompts Roselia to be honest with her. She teasingly asks if Roselia was kicked out of her house, a suggestion Roselia vehemently denies. Nadia presses further, pointing out that Roselia appeared out of nowhere the previous night asking to stay over, and then coyly asks if perhaps it's a guy problem. Roselia blushes furiously, stammering, "It's not like that." Nadia smirks, unconvinced. "Ah, so it is a guy problem. Must be nice to be at that age." Roselia sputters another denial, but Nadia simply replies, "Okay tilde," with a knowing look. Suddenly, Nadia starts coughing, and Roselia rushes to her side in concern, asking if she's all right, and if she remembered to take her medicine. Nadia reassures Roselia with a weak smile, confirming that she has been taking her medicine properly. Roselia listens with a concerned expression, as Nadia explains that it's just going to take a bit more time for her to recover fully. Nadia, ever the teaser, then tells Roselia she should worry about her boyfriend instead. Roselia exclaims Nadia, in embarrassment. Antonio, Roselia in disguise, returns to his assigned room at the Duke's estate, muttering about Nadia's boyfriend comment and insisting the earlier incident was just an accident. He's startled to hear Duke Balthazar greet him. "So, you're finally back." Duke Balthazar is seated calmly in Antonio's room and sternly asks where he has been. Antonio is shocked and dismayed to find the Duke there. Antonio demands to know why the Duke is in his room, but the Duke curtly retorts that Antonio should answer his question first. Antonio remains silent for a moment, internally fuming and questioning why his whereabouts should matter to the Duke. He then coolly states that it's his personal business and turns to walk away. Duke Balthazar's eyes narrow suspiciously as he watches Antonio, a thought forming in his mind. "Are you hiding a secret lover or something?" Antonio announces that he needs to change and politely suggests the Duke might want to leave. The Duke, however, tells him to wait a minute. A flicker of realization crosses the Duke's face as he thinks he detects a faint trace of a woman's perfume on Antonio. His suspicion growing, the Duke directly asks Antonio if he really met with a lover. Antonio bristles at the implication, questioning the Duke's right to pry into his personal business. The Duke reminds Antonio that as his employer, he has a duty to supervise and protect his employees. The Duke presses further, demanding to know exactly what kind of personal business was so important that it required Antonio to stay out all night. Antonio retorts sharply that even as his employer, he doesn't believe the Duke has the right to interfere in his private affairs, wondering why the Duke is picking a fight so early. The Duke coolly replies, "Is that so?" The Duke then asserts his authority, asking if he, as a Duke, has the right to question a commoner, implying Antonio is suggesting they ignore imperial law. Antonio sighs in exasperation. Antonio internally seethes, mentally cursing the Duke as a cruel employer, a heartless bastard, and a cold-blooded devil. Exhausted from lack of sleep and the ongoing interrogation, Antonio relents, deciding to give a quick answer and curtly states he met a friend. The Duke immediately asks, "A friend who?" Antonio retorts, "Would you even know if I told you?" Annoyed by the Duke's persistence, the Duke then asks, "Was it a man or a woman?" leaving Antonio utterly perplexed by the question. Antonio is bewildered, a sense of unreality washing over him as he wonders why his mouth seems to be moving on its own, about to answer the Duke's intrusive question. The Duke mentally chastises himself to get a grip, questioning why he even cares where Antonio was. Antonio, noticing the Duke's evident curiosity, offers to tell him. Antonio then states, "It was a woman," satisfied. The Duke's expression darkens perceptibly at the confirmation. Antonio declares he needs to prepare for work and asks the Duke to leave. The Duke mutters, "A woman, huh? So, it was a woman." Antonio defensively asks what's wrong with that. The Duke's composure finally snaps, as he angrily states that regardless of Antonio's private life, it is clearly affecting his work performance. Antonio points out that it's literally 7 a.m., well before official work hours. The Duke is momentarily silenced. The Duke then explodes in frustration, shouting that Antonio should be more careful. His tone, manners, posture, outfit, even his perfume, everything about him is annoying. The Duke scoffs dismissively and turns to leave. Antonio, bewildered by the outburst, mutters, "What is his problem? Did he eat something bad this morning?" Just as Antonio thinks the confrontation is over, the Duke abruptly turns back, startling him. The Duke leans in close and orders Antonio to set up a meeting with Roselia as soon as possible. Antonio, flustered, asks why and stammers if the Duke can't just tell him directly. Duke Balthazar smirks, replying coolly, "It's personal business." Antonio internally fumes, "This stingy bastard." The Duke then asks where Roselia is currently staying. Antonio hesitates, a troubled look on his face. Antonio silently anticipates the nature of the conversation between the Duke and Roselia, certain it will revolve around that story, the kiss. Recalling that the kiss was just an accident, Antonio tells the Duke that Roselia cannot meet him right now. The Duke immediately demands to know why not. Antonio, blushing and flustered, thinks he shouldn't get any more involved, lest he end up on a death route. He then states that Roselia is with someone important right now. The Duke repeats, "Someone important, huh?" his mind racing as he wonders if that person could possibly be. Before the Duke can complete his thought, Antonio makes a hasty retreat, calling back, "From this point on, it's a family matter." Duke Balthazar is left alone, wondering with a frown if Roselia was closer to Marquis Eucliade than he had initially thought. The seed of a significant misunderstanding planted. Later, Antonio is with a little girl, Erline, patiently teaching her to water flowers. She accidentally overwaters them, exclaiming, "It's flooding." Antonio quickly apologizes for her enthusiasm. Erline reassures Antonio, saying he didn't have to go that far in apologizing for her. He looks away, a pensive expression on his face. A man named Abelo approaches, greeting Antonio and remarking that his business of delivering the donation should now be complete. Abelo observes Antonio's troubled expression and asks if something is worrying him. Antonio forces a laugh and nervously denies being worried at all. Abelo teases, "Come on, Tilda, that face says otherwise. Looks like a big one too." Erline chimes in with a yup. Antonio wonders aloud if he really looks that worried, even to Erline. Antonio sighs, admitting it's not a huge deal, but there is someone who keeps bothering him. He explains that he doesn't want to initiate anything with that person, but due to work obligations, he has to keep seeing them, and he hates the ensuing awkwardness. Antonio's mind flashes back to the intense, unexpected kiss he shared with Roselia, as the Duke. He shakes his head, flustered, exclaiming aloud, "I must have gone crazy for a moment." Abelo and Erline watch his outburst with curiosity. Abelo then asks, "But you don't hate that person, do you?" Antonio immediately and vehemently protests, "What? I do hate them. I hate them the most in the whole world. It's awful." Abelo remarks that's a harsh thing to say. Abelo chuckles softly, "Is that so? Hee hee." Erline looks on, cradled in his arms. Abelo then offers some advice. Whether Antonio hates them or not, he has to face them first, because avoiding them isn't the solution. He suggests that making a firm decision would likely end Antonio's worry. Abelo claps Antonio on the shoulder encouragingly, reminding him, "Besides, you're a man. You can't just keep running away." Antonio internally agrees, though with a silent apology to Abelo for the deception. Antonio thanks Abelo sincerely, saying his advice really helped. Abelo dismisses the thanks, telling him not to mention it. Resolved, Antonio declares, "Yes, I won't run anymore." He bids farewell to Erline and Abelo, internally vowing to reject him, the Duke, clearly, and tie things off for good. As Antonio walks away, he witnesses an old man being roughly shoved to the ground by another man, who calls him an old geezer. The assailant callously tells the fallen old man, "If you're broke, get lost." The old man protests, frantically searching his pockets and insisting his money should be there. Antonio rushes to the old man's aid just as the old man exclaims, "I knew it." Finding his money, the assailant curses his rotten luck and walks off, while Antonio asks the grandpa if he's okay. Antonio gently chides the old man, saying one can't treat an elder like that. The old man glares up at him angrily, snapping, "Do I look okay to you?" Antonio quickly apologizes. The old man, still agitated, frantically pats his pockets again, shouting, "Where'd my money go? You stole it, didn't you? Damn it, Tilda." Antonio, annoyed, firmly denies stealing anything. Antonio offers to take the old man to where he lives. The old man belligerently refuses, shouting it's none of Antonio's business where he lives, and that he can go by himself. Antonio sighs, stepping back and saying, all right, Tilda, then go ahead." Huffs and stands. Antonio watches him for a moment. All right, Tilda, then go ahead, then turns away, huffs and stands, thinking to himself, "Not my problem." The scene shifts abruptly to the earlier kidnapping attempt. The main kidnapper has caught Roselia after she and Nadia tried to flee. The lead kidnapper, a man with a prominent scar, sneers, "Enough of your little games now." He glares at Roselia and Nadia, his voice menacing, "You've just made a huge mistake. How dare you touch us?" His threat is cut short as Duke Balthazar intervenes decisively. The scene shifts to Antonio, who is examining a letter and wondering aloud, "Berna's, the Count's house." The old man, now standing at the grand entrance of a mansion, turns and asks Antonio, "What are you doing? Not coming in?" Antonio stares in disbelief, thinking, "No way." Antonio follows the old man inside, stammering, "Why, you're the owner of this mansion, Grandpa." He then wonders, "Then whose house did I enter?" The old man simply states, "It's true," leaving Antonio completely bewildered. The old man turns, a thoughtful expression on his face, and remarks, "What a coincidence." A caption identifies him as Count Valdro de Bernas. Antonio is stunned, realizing he has stumbled upon a grand master and legendary genius painter, an encounter he never imagined. However, he then notices the mansion's dilapidated state, full of cobwebs, and wonders if anyone manages it. Count Valdro casually asks, "Can't you tell by looking? They all ran off." Antonio, still processing, asks why. The Count nonchalantly explains, "I forgot to pay them. Kids these days." Antonio is left speechless by the Count's casual disregard. Antonio recalls from the original story that Count Valdro suffered from dementia, but during his lucid moments, he would create masterpieces. He realizes that just one painting from the Count could instantly pay off the remaining Hessink family debt. He then asks, "But Grandpa, there's not a single painting here. Don't you paint?" Count Valdro looks at Antonio with a genuinely confused expression, asking, "Me? I know how to paint." Antonio panics internally. "If you ask me that question, what should I do?" Suddenly, Count Valdro's demeanor shifts, and he demands, "Anyway, who the heck are you to be in my house?" The narration dryly notes, "Looks like there's still a long way to go." The scene transitions to the Luguble Jet Imperial Palace Delegation Guest Annex. Lognan approaches Marquis Eucliod, Johans, announcing, "Marquis Eucliod, it's Lognan. I've looked into the woman named Roselia, as you instructed." Johans nods curtly. "Good." Lognon reports that her name is Roselia de Hessink, and that after the Baron died in debt, the Hessink siblings have been working together to repay it. Johannes registers surprise, exclaiming, "Siblings!" as he takes the report from Lognon. Lognon clarifies they are not blood siblings. According to records, the Baron remarried and officially registered Roselia and her mother into the family. Johannes asks when this occurred. Lognon replies, "It was 19 years ago." Johannes stares into the distance, a deeply troubled expression on his face. Johannes suddenly clutches his head, a look of anguish overcoming him. Lognon calls out, "Marquis," in concern. Johannes corrects Lognon, his voice strained. It was 20 years ago. His mind flashes back to a traumatic memory. That was the exact day his mother and Cecilia disappeared, images of their flight and his own fall haunting him. Lognon asks if Johannes is all right. Johannes, still reeling, realizes the timing of Roselia's family registration matches perfectly with his mother and Cecilia's disappearance. He then asks Lognon urgently, "By the way, what about Roselia's mother?" A desperate hope flickers in his eyes as he wonders if his own mother could still be alive. Lognon reports that Roselia's mother reportedly died 18 years ago. Johannes's hope deflates, and he murmurs in despair, "Was I too late?" Johannes, looking utterly crestfallen, manages a quiet, "I see." He then dismisses Lognon, saying, "Understood, you've done well." Lognon bows and thanks him. Alone, Johannes wrestles with troubling thoughts. Why didn't Mother return to the Marquisate if she was alive? Was she still being pursued? Did she hide him and Cecilia to escape them? He then questions why Mother and Cecilia, specifically, would be the ones after them, but immediately stops himself, realizing he can't be certain of any of this. He clenches his fists on the table, acknowledging that his theories might just be speculation fueled by his desperation. Despite the uncertainty, Johannes comes to one firm conclusion. But one thing is clear, I have to confirm if Roselia de Hessink is Cecilia. Later, Antonio, Roselia stretches, feeling refreshed after a bout of cleaning at the Count's rundown mansion. He cheerfully calls out, "Grandpa, come eat Tilda," bringing a tray of food. The Count grumbles in response, "Who are you calling Grandpa?" Antonio playfully ignores the protest, saying, "Fine, never mind then Tilda Tilda say ah." He holds out a spoonful of food, and the Count, surprisingly, opens his mouth. Antonio adds, "A healthy body leads to a healthy mind." Antonio then gently tells the Count, "You've got to get better and start painting again, Grandpa." As he says painting, the Count shivers, a sudden chill running down his spine. Back in her own identity, Roselia sits thoughtfully, recalling Mr. Abelot's advice. She touches her hair, his words echoing in her mind. Running away won't solve anything. The carriage arrives at a grand mansion. The coachman announces, "Ma'am, we've arrived." Roselia thanks him and gives instructions for her luggage to be left in the main building's first-floor hallway. Roselia takes a deep breath, her expression resolute. "This time, I'll end it for sure," she thinks, unaware that Antonio is watching her arrival with a questioning look from the carriage. Inside, Antonio announces to Duke Balthazar, "Duke, Miss Roselia is here." The Duke looks up from his desk, surprised. "Roselia." Duke Balthazar takes a moment to compose himself, thinking, "This time, I'll have a calm conversation." He mentally reinforces his resolve. No anger, rational. He then calls out, "Come in." As the door opens, Roselia steps inside, also telling herself, "Stay calm, stay calm." Roselia enters the Duke's office, her demeanor composed, and states, "I heard you wanted to see me." The Duke clears his throat, a hint of unease in his eyes, before asking, "Ahem. Where on earth have you been all this time?" Roselia replies calmly, "That's difficult for me to answer." The Duke immediately presses, "Were you with that man?" Roselia meets his gaze coolly. That's quite the accusation out of nowhere. The Duke's composure begins to crack. "Stop just talking already. This is exactly like before. Stop, were you with that man you call your lover?" He internally curses his own impatience. Roselia stands firm. "Whoever I was with is none of your business, Duke. I came today to make one thing absolutely clear." With unwavering conviction, Roselia declares, "I have no feelings for you, so please stop troubling Antonio and I." A smirk plays on Duke Balthazar's lips. "No feelings, you say?" He repeats, a dangerous glint in his eyes. He rises from his desk and approaches her. "Then what was that between us that day?" Roselia looks away, claiming, "I just got caught up in the moment." Roselia continues, "As you probably have heard from Antonio, I already have a lover. It meant nothing. It was just a mistake." "A mistake?" Duke Balthazar echoes, his voice dangerously soft. He leans in very close, their faces almost touching. Then let's see if this is also a mistake. He then captures her lips in a deep, passionate kiss, pulling back just enough to speak. Duke Balthazar gazes into Roselia's eyes, his voice husky. Even with a lover, you were able to do this with me. Is this also a mistake? Roselia closes her eyes, a blush spreading across her cheeks, utterly speechless and overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment.